Good morning. Welcome to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's Academic Research Council meeting. My name is Zita Martinez. I serve as the Associate Director for the External Affairs Division at the CFPB. Today's meeting is being held at the Bureau's headquarters in Washington, D.C., and is being live streamed at consumerfinance.gov. A recording of the meeting will be made available on the Bureau's website. You can also follow the Bureau on social media via Facebook and Twitter. In a few moments, I'll turn to Andrew Duke, who will kick off the meeting and introduce Director Kraninger. But first, I'd like to welcome our committee members and introduce the individuals who are serving on the Bureau's Academic Research Council, or ARC, during the fiscal year 2020 cycle. Members, when I call your name, please raise your hand. The ARC chair is Michael Bay. He is the Burt Elwert Professor of Business Economics and Public Policy at Indiana University's Kelley School of Business. Karen Dinan is Professor of the Practice of Economics, Department of Economics at Harvard University. Terry Friedland is Associate Professor of Social Work at the University of Michigan. John Lynch, Jr. is Director of the Center for Research on Consumer Financial Decision-Making and Senior Associate Dean for Faculty and Research at the Leeds School of Business, University of Colorado, Boulder. Tom Miller, Jr. is Professor of Finance and inaugural holder of the Jack R. Lee Chair of Financial and Consumer Finance at Mississippi State University. And Joshua Wright is University Professor at the Executive Director of the Global Antitrust Institute at Scalia Law School at George Mason University. We also have with us Brian Johnson, Deputy Director for the Bureau, and Matt Cameron, Staff Director for the Office of Advisory Board and Councils. I'm now pleased to introduce Andrew Duke. He serves as the Policy Associate Director for External Affairs and brings 27 years of experience in public policy, including 20 years on Capitol Hill, serving with 3 different members of Congress. He received his BA in Economics from Hampden-Sydney College in Virginia. Andrew?
Thank you, Zixta. Good morning, and thank you all again for being here with us today. As Zixta mentioned, my name is Andrew Duke. I serve as the Policy Associate Director for the Division of External Affairs, as well as the Division of Consumer Education and Engagement here at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. I'd like to thank all of our ARC members for agreeing to serve in this capacity to help advise the leadership of the CFPB and its director on a broad range of consumer financial issues, emerging market trends, and the Bureau's strategic research planning process and research agenda. For those of you live streaming, let me share a brief overview of our schedule today. Following the director's remarks, ARC Chair Michael Bay will conduct the meeting. Chair Bay will introduce Bureau subject matter experts for a discussion on the Bureau's Start Small, Save Up initiative. After that discussion, Chair Bay will then introduce Bureau subject matter experts for a discussion about the Bureau's research agenda. At approximately 12:45 p.m., the ARC will break for lunch. At 2:45 p.m., the roundtable will reconvene. Chair Bay will introduce Bureau subject matter experts for a discussion on defining consumer harm and consumer injury. Then at 3:45 p.m., the ARC roundtable will adjourn. As background, the CFPB established this committee to provide advice about the Bureau's strategic research planning process and research agenda related to consumer financial products or services, consumer behavior, and cost-benefit analysis, among other topics. As a reminder, the views of the ARC members are their views. They are greatly appreciated and welcome, yet they do not necessarily represent the views of the Bureau. I'm now pleased to introduce Director Kathy Kraninger. Director Craniger became the second confirmed director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in December 2018. From her early days as a Peace Corps volunteer to her role establishing the Department of Homeland Security, to her policy work at the Office of Management and Budget, and now to the CFPB, Director Craniger has dedicated her career to public service. It is my privilege to welcome her to today's roundtable meeting. Director Craniger, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrew, and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is the first meeting for some of you, so welcome to the Bureau, and I'm grateful that you accepted this appointment. Thank you for being patient during the application and selection process, and I can tell you that I am certain that the Bureau will benefit from your membership, but I certainly expect that all of you will as well. I'd also like to extend my appreciation to Michael Bay, our new chair, for taking on this important leadership role and helping the Bureau manage the Academic Research Council. The ARC was formed to advise the Bureau with respect to our strategic research planning process and research agenda, as well as to provide technical advice with respect to research methodologies. The Bureau's research can provide a strong empirical basis for what I see as the primary purpose and focus of the Bureau, preventing harm to consumers. As you know, Congress clearly articulated the purpose and objectives of the CFPB in the Dodd-Frank Act. Among other things, the Act states, the Bureau shall seek to implement and, where applicable, enforce federal consumer financial law consistently for the purpose of ensuring that all consumers have access to markets for consumer financial products and services, and that those markets are fair, transparent, and competitive. Congress gave significant powers and tools to the Bureau to carry out that mission. These include education, regulation, supervision, and enforcement. At the Bureau, we believe the best application of these tools is to focus on prevention of harm to consumers. We believe that if we can prevent harm before it occurs, we have saved consumers from the financial headaches, setbacks, and devastation. I'm so glad that all of you have volunteered to share your thoughts and perspectives, and I look forward to vigorous discussions on how best to harness our research capabilities to further our mission. Our agenda today focuses on 3 important topics that are before us right now. Let me briefly touch on each of them. One of the first things we will be talking about is our Start Small, Save Up initiative. Part of the Bureau's responsibilities include conducting financial education programs and ensuring that consumers receive timely and understandable information to make responsible decisions about financial transactions. With the multitude of public and private sector entities engaged in consumer financial education, I also want to ensure that the Bureau uses its education tool where it is uniquely positioned to add value and provide leadership. Specifically, the Bureau recognized a gap and conducted extensive research to develop a consumer-centric definition of financial well-being that goes beyond income and credit score. It captures a person's sense of financial security and financial freedom of choice in the present and in the future. Core to that security is control over day-to-day and month-to-month personal finances, as well as the capacity to absorb financial shock. We have also found that consumers can experience financial well-being, or lack of it, across a wide range of incomes. It is tied to financial skills and the confidence in those skills. Today's consumers need these skills even more. For example, fewer than half of Americans set aside money for their children's college education. More and more people reach retirement with incomes and savings that simply won't meet their needs. Perhaps most concerning to me was the Federal Reserve report that found that 12% of Americans say they could not cover a $400 emergency expense, and an additional 27% said they would turn to credit or sell something to cover an emergency. The goal of Start Small, Save Up is to move the needle on the number of Americans in this country who can cover a financial shock like a $400 emergency. I'm committed to bringing together partners from across sectors to develop and execute a strategy to achieve this outcome. The collective investment in financial education is substantial across the country, and I believe we can increase the level of emergency savings by bringing these efforts together. Research has an important role to play in helping us formulate successful strategies, and I look forward to your thoughts about promising areas for research. For example, research can help us measure the extent to which consumers save for emergencies, a challenging question in that emergency savings can be spent and then replenished. Research can help us understand the barriers to savings and why some consumers save, whereas others similarly situated do not. And research can help us evaluate which strategies are actually moving the needle on savings and not just enrolling consumers who would save with or without the intervention. Another important item on our agenda today, particularly one that all of you will no doubt have opinions about, is the Bureau's research agenda. Research forms the backbone of our key decisions. How do consumers make decisions that affect their financial well-being? What methods help consumers make informed decisions? How do we know when consumers are being harmed? Setting a research agenda will help us to answer the most important questions facing the Bureau. We have built an exceptional research office with highly skilled researchers. Although much of the time the Office of Research is necessarily devoted to analyzing the costs, benefits, and impacts of regulations, the Bureau is developing and supporting our fair lending examinations. And the research agenda that we adopt will shape the research output from the Bureau over the coming years. To produce that research, we have a wealth of assets to draw upon, like our consumer credit panel and the National Mortgage Database. And we have the capability to do surveys that we can pair with our administrative data, like the Making Ends Meet survey we have recently concluded. Plus, we can obtain new data by conducting lab and field trials. But we need to prioritize our efforts to make sure we're focused on the most important areas and rigorously researching important questions in those areas. So we're asking you for your insights on what are the most pressing research questions in consumer finance that the Bureau should try to answer. And as skilled researchers, we'd like your thoughts on how best to use our resources to answer those questions. And finally, in the last session, we'd like to hear your thoughts on how the Bureau can best define and measure consumer harm. The concept of consumer harm is central to much of our work. You can find it in the statute that created the Bureau. Indeed, the Dodd-Frank Act cites risks to consumers as a reason or factor to be considered in many specific Bureau activities, including market monitoring, supervision, and research. Furthermore, the concept of substantial injury is central to the concept of an unfair act or practice in both the Dodd-Frank Act and the Federal Trade Commission Act. The Federal Trade Commission has considered consumer harm in enforcement and rulemaking for decades, and since our inception, so have we. From my perspective, a main goal of this session is to bring academic researchers into this conversation. We want to hear about how social scientists define consumer harm and how that harm can be measured as rigorously as possible. We know this is a two-way street. Consumer financial products and services inherently can present risks. Credit, for example, cannot even be discussed without considering the time and uncertainties that come with repayment. A lot can go wrong, and the law does not envision that every bad outcome is a harm that merits a legal remedy. Ultimately, the Bureau's work involves balancing, and we know that balancing relies on good measurement, and that good measurement relies on clear and practical definitions. So we want to begin by hearing from experts on the foundational work that you have done or believe we should do in defining and measuring consumer harm. So again, thank you all for being here today. Thank you for serving on our advisory committee, and I look forward to your partnership and thoughts on all of these issues.
Thank you very much, Director. My name is Mike Bay. It's an absolute pleasure to have the honor to chair the Academic Research Council, or ARC, and especially to serve with such an esteemed group of social scientists that are also, like myself, academics, serving in this capacity. It's absolutely fantastic that the chairman has a commitment to ensuring that the actions of the Bureau are rooted in the scientific method, and very happy to be here in that regard. I'd like to Also, thank you, Dr. Craniger, for actually being here for the entire day today. And I understand you were participating with other advisory committees yesterday, so it's by revealed preference, you care a lot about this, and it's absolutely fantastic that you do. Look forward to working with you in the future. Today's meeting, as the director pointed out, are going to focus on three very important initiatives here at the Bureau. We're going to be talking about the Bureau's Start Small, Save Up initiative, its research agenda, and also defining consumer harm and consumer injury. So without further ado, we're going to begin our first session, and I'd like to introduce the staff that'll be navigating us through the important work that the Bureau is doing in this dimension. First of all, across the table from me is Jason Brown, Assistant Director for the Office of Research. Melissa Knoll, Section Chief, Decision Making and Behavioral Studies for Office of Research. Carolyn Ratcliffe, very good, Senior Economist for the Office of Research. LaShawn Warren, Campaign Manager from the Division of Consumer Education and Management. Desmond Brown, didn't raise his hand, okay. Deputy Director from the Division of Consumer Education and Management. And to my left, we have Tom Paul, Policy Associate Director for the Division of Research, Markets, and Regulations. And David Silberman, Associate Director from the same division. So thanks for joining us. I'll now turn it over to you fine folks to enlighten us.
Great, thank you so much. So the way we're going to set this up is I'm going to just go through some slides, and then we want to hear from you, and we'll facilitate a conversation among the Start Small Save Up team up here. So I'm new to the ARC members, most of the ARC members, and so just a few words about myself. I have done a lot of research on savings. While I'm new to you, I'm not new to the savings field. I've done a lot of work on emergency savings, a randomized control trial of matched savings program, as well as looking at debt in a lot of detail and financial well-being. So I'm new to the Bureau. I came from the Urban Institute where a lot of that research was done, and I've been here at the Bureau since early this summer. And I just want to say before I get into the slides so we are representing, Melissa and I co-chair the Research and Evaluation Work Stream under Start Small Save Up, but we are a cross-bureau initiative and cross-disciplinary. So a couple of our colleagues are here also. Brianna Middlewood, Jack Gardner are in the Office of Research, as well as we have folks in consumer education and engagement that are part of the Research and Evaluation Work Stream, so Dave Saminsky's here. And this meeting is really a great time for us to come together because while we have framed the work that we're doing, we're in the early stages. And so as I said, I'm just going to give a brief overview, but the biggest focus is for us to hear from you. And we have a disclaimer. So maybe you, do I have to read this? No, okay, great. I hadn't seen that earlier. Here we go. Okay. So just as a backdrop to the initiative, the director mentioned this, but many consumers report a lack of emergency savings, and many consumers experience financial shocks. So the few data points, the most commonly cited is this one from the Federal Reserve Board that the director mentioned. There's also a study by Pew that found that 56% of people worried about their finances in the past year, and among that 56%, 83% worried about a lack of savings. So along with this lack of savings, there's also a lot of volatility in families' lives. And this statistic is from another Pew report that found that 60% of families experienced a financial shock in the past year. And this is drops in income, but also expense spikes. So about 25% of families experience a significant drop in income. These expense spikes, about 30% report a significant cost to repair a car, 25% home repair. So we've got this situation where we have a lack of savings and a lot of volatility. I want to mention that as part of Start Small Save Up, we are also going to be using our Making Ends Meet survey data that the director mentioned, and that is built off of the Consumer Credit Panel, but it has information on monthly savings habits, ability to handle financial shocks, experience running out of money. So that's going to be part of this work to add to this base of what we know. So we've got this combination of a lack of savings as well as these shocks, and this can affect financial well-being. And again, the director touched on this, that the Bureau's done a lot of work on financial well-being, that the Bureau work shows that having higher levels of savings is associated with higher levels of financial well-being. So on the left side, we have liquid savings. This is cash on hand, dollars in checking and savings accounts. And what this figure shows is that as you move up to higher levels of liquid savings, we see higher levels of financial well-being. And one thing I want to point out is that even at small dollars, you can see a few $100s as you move up levels of financial well-being increase. And this is found in other research that controls for income. In the randomized evaluation I mentioned, we found that people were saving and we looked at financial stress was reduced. So that's a little bit of a motivation. So the overall vision of Start Small Save Up, and then I want to talk about the research and evaluation work group. So the vision is to increase people's opportunities to save and empower them to achieve their savings goals as a step to improve financial well-being. And we talk about financial well-being because emergency savings is really a flow. So people save, there's a shock, they spend it, and then the goal is that they save back up. So it's harder to measure than if we think about retirement savings, where the goal is that people increase their savings throughout their working lives as they near retirement. We have 5 work streams. We've put research and evaluation at the top of this circle here. But the research and evaluation piece was built in from the beginning, and we really see this as a foundation for the other work streams. So the other work streams are employers, partnerships. So here, this would be partnerships with financial institutions, fintech companies, other government agencies, communities, and outreach and engagement. So to make this a little bit more concrete, so our employers work group is actively engaging with employers around strategies to increase the savings of their employees. So the research and evaluation work group, we're working with them and we're used to sort of build in what we know from the literature to inform those strategies. And at the same time, we're looking for opportunities to set up pilots and tests. So basically this test and learn. So we can think about strategies around financial incentives, automation, messaging. The goal of the research and evaluation work group is enhancing the evidence base of Start Small Save Up, collecting, analyzing, reporting on data. So we really do see ourselves both as a foundation for the other work as well as providing evidence to the field. Our planned activities, so the first is before we embark on our work, we really need to understand what's out there and what works and doesn't work, so we're cataloging what's been rigorously tested in the field. We're also doing a scan of the field, so we expect that there's a lot of interesting initiatives out there that are helping people save, and they're promising, but they're untested. So we want to understand what they are and look for opportunities where we could evaluate. And we're also doing a scan of the field for existing data. So particularly if we think about fintech companies, they have lots of data. What are the opportunities for us to get that data and to learn in-house about people's consumers and consumer needs? And this third bullet here is really, we're trying to get at this pilot and testing strategies to increase emergency savings. So this is field studies. And then the final two, this first one is just what I had said earlier, that we'll be putting together a publication using our new Making Ends Meet survey data, which just arrived at the Bureau in September, so it's really exciting for us. And the final point here is we're conducting a series of research experiments. So these are lab experiments on the savings and debt puzzle. So this is the phenomenon we're looking at where people simultaneously hold savings and credit card debt, and that's being led by one of our psychologists, Brianna Middlewood. So this is an overview of where we are with the initiative. So now it's really for us to hear from you, and I will stop talking. But before that, so we're really looking at opportunities where we can add to the field, and we are doing this cataloging. But so our first question, and you have the whole series of questions, and we don't have to be super rigid, but why don't we start with this first one, and we can chime in. People can, jump around a little bit. But what are the underexplored areas in the savings space where additional research would be helpful for helping us identify effective saving strategies? And we, of course, know that there's not a one-size-fits-all. So as part of this, it's like, what are the specific populations or strategies for specific populations and what we need to know in that space? So I'll just throw it open.
I have a question on just a fundamental question. I don't know what the literature shows, but I don't think it's a secret that people should save money. I mean, in my lifetime, long lifetime, it's pretty well known, but what's the fundamental reason that people don't save money? If that's obviously been studied hard, but what is the impediment?
Well, what we do know from the literature is, so this issue of low savings is not just a low income issue, it goes up the income distribution. What we do know is that when people are given incentives to save, they will save. If we think about the incentive that higher income people get to save through preferential treatment for retirement savings, mortgage interest tax deduction, there's incentives to purchase a home. So those are the two key ways that people build their wealth. But we do know that low income people can and will save, and particularly when they're given incentives. And we know that the opt-in feature or the opt-out feature of retirement savings has really been effective in increasing people's participation in retirement savings. There has been some talk about doing something like that for emergency savings as well, to make it automatic, that you don't have to think about it, but that you're setting it up and it happens automatically.
So just to kind of follow up, I found that very, very interesting. And I guess one thought that I had is your focus really is on kind of these short-term shocks that would lead people to need a little nest egg to draw on. And it strikes me that there is kind of this trade-off between, saving for retirement, these long-term funds, versus the nest egg. And I'm just wondering to what extent there can be trade-offs or crowding out across those two dimensions. And that could particularly adversely affect individuals, that don't have the means to save. I think that's where Tom was coming from. Some people just don't earn a lot of money, and therefore they're not going to save. Implicit, I think, in the question. And it strikes me that, as you contemplate incentives to induce people to save, there are competing institutions in Washington, like the Department of Labor, Social Security Administration, that are trying to provide incentives for people to save for retirement, right? Those incentives typically provide upfront benefits, tax deductions. That's as you climb up the income ladder, as you said. But then there are these penalties associated with drawing those funds out, right? That when confronted with paying a 10% tax penalty, that might induce people to take credit card debt. And I'm just wondering to what extent the research program that you're envisioning here is recognizing that short-term shocks might somehow be linked to, long-term saving, short-term saving decisions. So just rambling, but.
I can start. So I think you're raising a really important point, and that's why we also want to look at financial well-being. We do know that there's a lot of people who they don't have access to employer-provided retirement savings, and they're not taking advantage of what's available. it would be nice if our other ARC member, Bridget Madrian, was here. She's done a lot of work on this idea of sidecar savings with AARP, where they are really worried about this exact point, that people are taking money out of their retirement savings accounts, and they have a penalty and they're using it for emergencies. So the idea of these accounts is that you enroll people into an emergency savings plan, and then once that reaches a limit, it can go into retirement. So that you're trying to help people sort of create that buffer in the short term, but as a roadmap for longer term financial security, not to hinder it. But I think you're right. There's a lot we don't know about sort of the short term and the long term, but we are aware of it. Sorry.
Yeah, so one thing I would add that I think is related is, as Caroline mentioned and as you alluded to, we do know a lot about retirement savings and the things that work and what doesn't work, and kind of what encourages people to save for retirement and other things like that. So I think one of the things that we'll be looking at is, what are the distinctions between retirement savings and short-term emergency savings? What makes them different? There's the time horizon, there's maybe the concreteness of the goal. Emergency savings is kind of this like nebulous thing that we kind of understand what emergencies are, we might not. Some people might not want to dip into their savings for something they don't think rises to the level of an emergency, but we do know what retirement is. There are also kind of potentially social norms around these different kinds of things, and kind of, like I said, goals in terms of long and short term, but also we kind of understand a little bit how much we need for retirement. We don't necessarily know how much we need for emergencies. There's different standards there. So I think one area of exploration is kind of studying specifically what are the differences between these types of savings that we know more and less about, and digging into some of those things as we're approaching this question.
So I wanted to ask, Caroline, you kind of alluded to this about employer benefit plans and low-income folks having access to those, and I wondered the extent to which some of the structural conditions in the environments in which people are experiencing, how those affect abilities to save. And also just to kind of add, that some of the questions, the foundations of your research, there is a fairly long and robust literature on some of the mechanisms like opt-in and having incentives to save, and that people do engage in those when they're provided to them, and what's the extent to which those are provided to folks in their environments.
So on the structural conditions of the workplace, that I'm not as familiar with. I mean, I think what our employers work group is going in to employers and to try to set up mechanisms to help folks save. What can the employer do? So if some of those barriers, like here we're looking at Split to Save, there's other, America Saves has been doing that with a number of employers. So basically setting it up so people can split their paycheck into both a checking and savings account. And one of the issues is if people don't have a savings account, then that's another barrier. And then I think, just the opt-out part, there is a lot of, as I said, there's a lot of interest in testing that as a strategy around the emergency savings piece. And that because if you can get it set up, set it and forget it, or not even have to set it, if it's just people are automatically, when they come in as an employee, say some percent of their paycheck would go into an emergency savings account. But it's not been something that has been tested yet.
If I could just jump in on the work you're doing with employers, I think it's terrific. I think employers are a really important part of helping people to save. That's been demonstrated in the research. I wonder if part of the effort could be also talking to employers about the burden or barriers or costs of doing these interventions, because we, for example, can see that large employers, many of them offer retirement savings plans. That's not so true for smaller employers. So if you're thinking about how to actually act policy-wise, kind of figuring out what the barriers are, not just on the household side, but on the employer side, to doing these sorts of things for these employees is important. And then just a second comment related to this, which is I think it's not only important to think about encouraging people who have kind of traditional relationship with their employers to save. That's where a lot of the literature has been. But given the evolution of the labor market, we know that increasing numbers of workers have kind of these non-traditional relationships. They're doing contract work or they're in the gig economy. And what can be done for those people to help them encourage them to save?
Great, thank you.
If I could chime in. So I think another piece of it is just the psychological factors that affect savings. So one of the things that I think deserves more study was alluded to already, and that's how people view the fungibility between these different sources of savings. So when we talked about college savings, retirement, emergency, and to what extent do people see those as permeable or not? And then there's the psychology of how people frame a pool of money and whether or not they think it's usable for a particular purpose. So one of the things that we're studying in our shop is retirement plan leakage that happens at job separation. And it appears that people are using it in ways that seem sensitive to whether they frame that pool of money as not something that is necessarily for retirement security, but something that's for that is flexibly labeled as something for emergencies, where people drain their entire retirement account when they change jobs, and now they're back and they're 35 years old and they're back at zero with what they had saved. So that substitution between these different domains is something that you're in a position to study, where I think that it's difficult for other entities to do that. And then the other thing that was alluded to already, somebody mentioned this issue of the nebulous nature of what you should have for emergency savings. And so one of the things that keeps people from striving for a goal is when they don't think they're going to achieve it. And so the issue of what does one need for a particular purpose is critical. I have a colleague that we recruited from she's now in our finance faculty, her name is Emily Gallagher, who studies the issue of, well, how much do people actually need in their emergency accounts? Because if you tell somebody who has few resources that you need $2,000 or some large number, then they say, I shouldn't strive. And yet, whereas if you could do research and establish that a lower number was actually going to provide a lot of the benefit, then that may make people perceive that it's possible. And then I just like have an overarching remark over all that is that some of this is psychology. And so on your team, the idea of having a team of social scientists across the board is really useful.
Thank you very much for that. I'm very interested in what you said about the retirement and people taking money out. And I was talking to someone recently who works at a credit bureau with a lot of lower income clients. And the framing, she was saying how the framing of emergencies, like people want to know what they can use. They don't like the word emergency, at least her clients. And so I think it is important for us to think about, as we're framing it out in the world with people who are struggling, that the terms that we use might not be the best terms or the terms that they react to or respond well to.
Which I would say is another reason why the point that Tom made earlier about you're having partnerships both in the academic community and in the business practitioner community is super useful for you to have those institutional insights.
Are there any other thoughts here? Well, let me just put up some of our other oops, I went back. Let's see. So the next question here is advantages. Do you see advantages and disadvantages of working with different types of partners? So here we are with our employers and our partnerships group, thinking about employers, financial institutions, fintech companies, different ones, different sizes. Any thoughts there? And also that next question is, what types of partnerships do you think would be most valuable for our work? Any thoughts here?
Well, I think in terms of picking and choosing, I've got no advice there on which type of partners you want, but I do think one of the key advantages of partnering with institutions like employers, for example, is the opportunity to do field experiments, to actually test out different mechanisms to move the needle in terms of savings rates, for example. In terms of, the disadvantages, one of the disadvantages you might find that the policy you think is going to work doesn't work. So a lot of places in Washington don't want to do the experiment because they may not like the answer, and that's why I'm very happy that you're here to care about the underlying science. You obviously have to make sure that it's a randomized control, and that the employer that you get to sign up doesn't have characteristics that are materially different than other employers out there. But one partnership that I would strongly encourage you to think about is partnering with the academic community. I know you've got a symposium coming up in December, a research symposium, where you're going to have a number of academics come in. And, one of the scarce resources that you folks have that the typical academic doesn't have is the deep institutional knowledge and the access to really fantastic data sets. And so to the extent that you can leverage that to partner with academics that might not have those skills, but might have other skills that could complement the types of research that you want, could be incredibly valuable, I think, for policymaking and ultimately the types of research that guides the things that the director wants to do.
Mike, can I ask you a question? Just if you think about partnering with employers, and you said a randomized control would be ideal, that raises so in theory what you'd like to be able to do is say this group of employees gets this program and this group of employees doesn't get this program, to see whether the employers may have some resistance to offering a benefit to some employers, not others. Do you have thoughts as to how you might be able to get around that sort of challenge of the desire for randomized control and the employer's potential desire to treat everybody the same?
I think that's why my caveat was be careful. The employer that's willing to allow you to do the experiment may not be representative of the employer out there. So I just give that caution. I've got no inside information on how you convince a particular type of employer to do that. Or, there's other types of randomized experiments you can do as well. You talk about financial institutions and
Yeah, so I was going to say, related to that, it's not unique to employers. So we've worked with not financial institutions, other companies before, where kind of convincing to withhold a treatment or that there needs to be a control group or randomization is definitely a challenge and something that we go back and forth. So I'm interested in the thoughts of the group around the different types of research. So obviously the RCT is the gold standard. Sometimes there can be other types of program evaluations or collecting data where there might not have been an RCT. So the types of things that Caroline lined up about collecting data from companies that are already doing things, or overlaying potentially some study on a company that's already been doing something, but they may have not necessarily had a treatment and control exactly in that way. What are the different types of things we can learn from different types of research?
If I can chime in. So this is answering both that question and the preceding one. So I'm on the board of this organization, Common Sense Lab, which is a nonprofit that's aimed at fintech to help lower and middle income people. And I was just at their board meeting, and they're having exactly this kind of discussion about who are relevant partners. It turns out that it's very difficult. Some of their enthusiastic small partners don't have the ability to do things at scale, so that winds up militating toward larger partners. And another thing that happens is when you have some research-informed interventions, they don't always work. And so I think their hit rate is like 50% on some of these interventions. And so which is good, right? But part of that is that some types of research are more expensive than others. And so I know in your capability, the fact that you've got the suite of all these methodologies, that if you're not entirely sure about the particular way to implement this, that's a place where laboratory experimentation is useful as a predecessor before you go in there and do the big field experiment. And I guess the other insight I would say from talking with those other folks is that they find these fintech companies to be readier to do the randomized experiments than to go into a particular employer. The employers have this sort of this duty to their employees that makes them reluctant to have the randomized thing.
So I would add also to both the questions about partnerships and about the types of research, I was chuckling to Michael's suggestion about partnering with academics and researchers, which, as a member of the Academic Advisory Council, that wasn't the first partnership that rose to my mind. It was, it was thinking about the groups that are and organizations that are most closely connected to the people with whom you are trying to reach. So that can be an employer, it can be a financial institution, and I think there are also a range of organizations, nonprofit intermediaries that have financial coaches or counselors, other sorts of educators that are sitting with clients and helping them navigate some of these decisions that are very close to the realities that people are experiencing. And to the question about the methods, I think RTCs are important and empirical data is important. And when we have the ability to answer questions with empirical data, we can and should do so. And there are, clearly decisions about cost and related to implementing those types of studies and methods. I think there's also kind of a multiplicity of knowledge, and it depends on the type of question that you're asking and what you want to receive in return. And often being able to triangulate data, different types of data from many different angles and sources is what strengthens your position on a particular topic. So in some of the RCTs that myself or that my colleagues have worked on, having a treatment control or a treatment participant marry a control participant is a little bit, difficult for your RCT, the rigorous testing of your RCT that you have been so careful to implement in the field where real things happen. Yeah. So being able to demonstrate across a wide range of methods and data points, qualitative to quantitative, I think builds a really strong case. It's not any one particular study in the literature that we point to, really. It's a body of research that has a consistent story to tell us.
I just wanted to I guess, largely echo some of the thoughts that Terry and others have offered. One of the reasons, at least within the economics professions, that RCTs have become the goal. We had all the nice things about causal inference, and it's fantastic, but one of the reasons there's been a little bit of an overreaction about non-RCTs is a body of work, sometimes by I'm an economist, but a legal academic, and some of my legal academic friends, and maybe me sometimes, will sort of overclaim where there's not sort of real causal inference. And I think we've seen in the economics profession a pushback against that, and for lots of good reasons. We get lots of really, really nice things out of well-done RCTs. One of the things, and this is more comment and compliment than question, one of the things that struck me and reading through some of the materials sort of in preparation for this meeting was the degree of care in articulating what inferences could be drawn from what comparisons. When there is causal inference to be had, there is a claim that there is causation, and when there is not, there's sort of careful talk about what inferences can be drawn, and that is what makes the heterogeneity in studies your friend, and the friends of the policymakers and the friends of consumers of the studies. And I think, I was really impressed with the degree of care, attention paid to that question in the materials that I read. And I think it should be highlighted that the heterogeneity in approaches, whether they're descriptive, descriptive data on some of these questions that really, where there are none, right? The marginal benefit of descriptive data in those areas is really, really high. We might not know the causal questions to ask yet in some of these areas, and so just wanted to add another voice to the idea that those things are really valuable, and especially when coupled with sort of being careful about what inferences can be drawn from RCTs versus not, and that should never, I think, be taken as discouragement from doing non-RCT based work. One separate thought I will make quickly is in terms of partners and partnerships, maybe one that's less likely, it's not on the slide in any event, but
there are other agencies around. I have a bunch of economists who I used to work at one, Mike used to work at one. And at least when I was there, I mean, we talked about, there were partnerships and enforcement, right? You had to share information and data and on cases on the enforcement side. But in terms of the research and reporting function across, I mean, agencies, you guys have cool data. They have different data. I don't know if it's cool. You guys might have asked, and it might not be cool. I don't know. Maybe you have all the cool data, which is great. But I think for other agencies that are in complementary areas and thinking about, I got a bunch of economists and social scientists over at other agencies too, and maybe there are benefits, gains from trade from those sorts of partnerships as well. Maybe not, but perhaps worth thinking about.
I think, Josh's point is great. I think, is Jesse Leary still at, here? He did some, no, okay. Well, he did some great work at the FTC in relation to the FACTA scoring study, where he was, obtaining data from, other government agencies. So even on the data, the researcher side, but the data side, there are ways that I get that it's costly for people like you to make these things happen. But from the researcher standpoint, you've got access to way more than the typical academic could possibly get in terms of matching up characteristics of individuals and so forth. So exploit those. I do want to, I kind of led with field experiments, as you say, that is the gold standard, but don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good here. You've got the ability to do significant work, before-after analysis to the extent that you know that a financial institution or an employer changed a policy over time. You can get at the causality questions that Josh is alluding to. With those approaches, you might be able to use difference in difference analysis if you've got one state that, I get that it's great to have, anyway.
Thank you for saying that, because some of the things we've talked a little bit about staggered rollout. If you have employers in different places, is there a way you can put it out first in one place versus another and look at those beforehand? So try to do some things where it's not true RCT, but we're getting close.
Or natural experiments, right? Mm-hmm. If you with all the connections that you have, you've got a lot of credit unions and banks and so forth on the other advisory boards. There's got to be ways that you can identify events that might have naturally occurred, mm-hmm. that you can use as a natural. So you got inside information on potential natural experiments, which is a great tool. So.
If I can just jump in. So first of all, I totally concur about the perfect being the enemy of the good. And I also, just to come back to David's point, my experience is there are just a lot of people who are in a position to do an intervention and they really just don't want to exclude some group because they're worried about leaving that group behind. A couple of general thoughts on partners, and one is just, I think horizon is important in this literature. So, finding out that an intervention works 6 months later is great and advances our knowledge, but really for this question, being able to look again after a year or after 2 years to see, what happened to that, or try to figure out what happened to the money you motivated them to save is important. So I think that's something to consider as you're thinking about who would make a good partner, is just their willingness to kind of be in a relationship with you and how long. The other thing I want to say, and maybe it's more of a question, which is you have all these fantastic data assets here, and I'm curious if you partner with, say, a fintech firm or an employer, is there scope for taking the data that you get from that kind of intervention and doing some sort of administrative merge with some of your rich data sets that you have here, just because that could just kind of greatly expand what you have to work with?
So actually, Michael, I actually was thinking of people who don't save money in employer matching plans. Okay, so you're buying $1 for 50 cents. Why don't you buy as many as you can? And to me, that's an interesting area to look at. What is the participation rate? And you can then measure if you have some program, you can at least measure that participation rate in employee matching programs. among college professors, they don't always save with employing. With some private universities have matching programs. So why don't people max those out? What's the impediment? What's going on? And then if you do have some program, you can then measure how people have changed over, at least in that area. So.
Thank you.
Karen, to your point, one observation or two observations, the question, just the Making Ends Meet survey that Carolyn referenced, we are planning a follow-up to the same respondents. It's the research design is we ask them to anticipate what would they do if something happens, and then we go back 6 months later and ask them, has these things happened, and what did you do, so we can do that. Now, as of right now, I think the research design ends at 6 months is the second wave, 6 to 8 months, but it may be that we should think about extending that. The other thing I'd note, and then ask if people have thoughts on, one of the capabilities that we have, so John mentioned laboratory work as a preface to field work. We have, in addition, we have some traditional labs. We've contracted with universities to work in their labs to do work. We've also built a mobile lab. Essentially, think about it as a series of iPads, where we can go out in the field and do anything you could do in the lab, but without being restricted to the population of students or employees of universities. So to the extent people have thoughts about how that tool might be deployed in support of this research initiative, that would be quite interesting.
One quick thing I'll add about the long-term look at some of these interventions is that we think a lot about how we're uniquely suited, and I think actually maybe this is one of the questions, sorry, uniquely suited in the Bureau compared to, let's say, an academic institution. And I think we love publishing, of course, and we're excited to publish our results, but I think that we are on a little bit of a slower timetable than academics, so we kind of have the ability to sit back and wait for more data to come in before we publish that report or something of that nature. And obviously, it's a give and take with the employer or institution, as you mentioned, but I think that we kind of have that luxury of not having to publish on a certain timeline that gives us the ability to do exactly that kind of thing.
So if I could chime in on this. So the two things you can get out of that you're talking about having like a data truck type where you, or a roving lab. So the two things that the lab piece can do for you is they can help you understand the mechanism by which something has an effect. So if you just did like a field experiment that people get it, say it's a disclosure or not, and it worked or it didn't work to a certain degree, you don't know why. Whereas the kinds of stuff that these folks do help understand the why. You know, for some of the stuff, for example, Dustin has done and so on. So that's a key piece of it. The other thing that you can get out of the data truck is to try to exploit the heterogeneity you actually get in your sample, and then take a look at subgroup analyses and try to understand the which people, and the which people have a certain response helps you understand the why. And that helps you scale up before you do this large-scale intervention and test it at scale in some kind of a field setting. So it's a really important capability for what you're doing.
Great, thank you. Maybe we can, one of the questions that sort of came up at the beginning is measuring, and you talked about crowding out. So this question here, how should we measure success? And what types of measures should we prioritize? And of course, it depends on the intervention, but just broadly, if we're thinking we're trying to increase savings, obviously we want to improve people's well-being. I'd love to get your thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's the $10,000 question in my mind. I think it's very difficult, in my judgment, to measure success in a way that doesn't result in unintended consequences. So if the goal is to induce people to save more, you can just adopt laws that say, 20% of your earnings have to go into a short-term savings account, right? And then you run into that issue is, okay, if you then preclude people from taking that money out when they, have a shock, then have you really increased liquidity? That's why the crowding out question is important in my mind. But what I think is particularly important for you folks is the unintended consequences of forced savings. Does it lead to people to go to pawn shops more often? Are they taking out more payday loans because they're saving more for a rainy? And then you have the behavioral issues. You know, you've got these mental accounting systems potentially for this is my savings account, I don't want to touch it for behavioral reasons. Does that then induce people to be more vulnerable to having to rely on these, you know, secondary, tertiary markets that I think some people have a distaste for? So I think it's an incredibly important question. All I would say is make sure you don't answer those questions in a vacuum. If your goal is to induce more savings, make sure there aren't unintended consequences that are going against other issues, areas that you might have concerns.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and it underlies a lot of our interest in looking at savings and debt simultaneously. Savings and one of those studies we talked about is the credit card debt puzzle, things of that nature. But also in some of our partnerships, we're trying to look at companies that show the flow of cash. So simultaneously with the savings feature, let's say on an app, a lot of those companies also have the bank account information and things of that nature, so we can see a little bit more of the bigger picture. So we're trying to work on that type of partnership to look at exactly that type of question.
I think your point, your question also is making me think about surveys and the extent to which we would want to do follow-up surveys, because to get at have you used a payday loan, what's happening beyond what we can see in the cash flow in the account, so we could think about that potentially for some of our work.
Another issue that I'm thinking about as it relates to measuring success is if part of our goal is to help people to prepare for emergencies or shocks, but then they spend down, you know, we can't look at this issue as in the way we look at retirement, where someone starts at whatever number and over time they get to this number and that's success. Helping people to manage shocks is really important to this. So someone can start with $500 in June, and in September there's a shock, so they spend down that $500. If you look at them over 6 months, how do you classify it as a success? Where for me, I think that is a very successful thing. They might now have $200 in October or whatever. So that's part of the conversation that I hope that we could talk a little bit about. And also the other thing is motivations. How do you motivate a person to take action to have that $500 for that emergency that they might not be thinking about? Similarly, on the motivation side, how do you motivate employers or other partners to get involved in something like this? Because for a small or a large company, getting involved in a research project like this might be, you know, there's some opportunity cost. So if we can help them figure out the impact on their employees or the impact on the bottom line or whatever that positive impact might be that might motivate them, I think that might also help. So don't want to take us off course, but those are just a couple of things that are coming into my mind.
Can I jump in on that one? So totally agree. Actually, if anything, I think you guys are overselling how easy the retirement literature is, because actually having worked in the retirement literature, actually it is frustrating. Like that number that you refer to, like we don't know what that is. It depends on the person. It depends on what kind of retirement benefits they're going to have. So an alternative approach is just, and this is something that Jason and I used in a paper, is look directly at hardship and whether people are experiencing hardship. So we did this for older households, but you know, you can imagine this in your studies, which is at the end of the day, what you care about is, you know, whether people are experiencing less hardship because of the saving you have encouraged them to do. So I think, if you can directly, measure that by looking at measures. So for example, some of the measures I've used in research is, did people have to cut back on their food expenditures? Did they fall into poverty? Or did some kind of broader measure of their kind of financial assets and income put them in some danger zone? So I think kind of directly looking, if you can measure it, directly looking at the hardship outcomes could be constructive as part of the agenda.
Yes, I agree. That's a very important point. And how we measure success also strikes me as somewhat of a qualitative question. The extent to which a person who is saving for emergencies, particularly someone who is from a lower income group and financially vulnerable, what would they define that success to look like? Because at the $400 mark, I could imagine that there are a number of emergencies. Your bus runs late for work, or your toaster breaks for breakfast that are at price points that would vary by the context of a person's situation. But success in those contexts might be able to have the financial resources at the ready to repair them, and were they able, when that emergency arose, to afford what they had been trying to save for, which could be captured in other ways, like hardship.
So in Mike's comment about why, if you think a certain behavior is desirable, just legislate it. The reason why people don't do that is because there's heterogeneity, and so the same behavior that's desirable for one person may be undesirable for another. So my view of one important success metric for the Bureau, if you have some particular actions intended to help consumers in a certain way, is to see whether it improves selectivity. If it's possible for you to say this subgroup probabilistically it's more likely that it's a good thing for them to behave in this way, and this group it's different. If you see that your interventions are improving sorting in a way that you think is appropriate, that would be something I think would be desirable.
So are there any thoughts that folks have on types of interventions that we might want to test? I mean, we were thinking about different types of financial incentives. There's messaging. There's different ways we could think about automation. Do folks have any thoughts on what might be priorities for us? We have lots of ideas ourselves.
Can you test Mike's law? Mike's suggesting we just mandate it and test that?
Yeah, that hasn't been in our working group conversations.
I would be interested, I mean, in speaking of things that have been mandated recently and the opportunity for difference and differences analyses. The state of Michigan recently raised the asset limits for SNAP benefits, right? And I would imagine that if you are a person who is receiving government benefits in some way, and all of a sudden there is a new threshold at which you can save for emergencies, that might be an opportunity to test for behavior changes.
And just to add in a positive point on the savings piece, when I had done the research at Urban doing a randomized control trial, what we found, so this was low-income people, and they had an incentive to save, but we found that they saved at the median about $650. They had lower material hardship, reduced use of check cashing, but what we actually, and they weren't taking it out for emergencies, but what we actually think was happening was that the program was helping people stay connected to benefits. So that's the way that they were able to save and not increase their material hardship. So I think that you're bringing in the asset limit piece is a part of this, and the program that we evaluated, as their savings went up, it was not counted in those asset limits, and we think that was really important.
We've just got just a few moments left, and I thought it would be fair to give the director a chance to talk about what it's like to drink from a fire hose from a bunch of academics.
Thank you, Mike, for that, and thank you, everyone, for the discussion around this. As you can see, we've certainly put a lot of thought and energy into it, and at the same time, we know that we're not the only font of information and thoughts about how to best go about doing this. Certainly, it's helpful. I think the partnership with other agencies with respect to the data and thinking they have, and other sources of data is something that we've been very interested in, because as valuable as that gold standard RCT is, also takes a really long time both to set that up. We found that in our work, to set that up and then to actually see the results of it and do the follow-up of it. a lot of resources and energy around that. And I've been really pushing on what opportunity is there to take some of these products and services that are midstream, where companies have the information, maybe they don't have the ability to research it or research it in the same way that we would, and same with other agencies. So again, the opportunity to take that data and maybe get some wider perspective on it. So thoughts you have around that obviously was useful and helpful too to hear. And I do think there is a lot of opportunity, probably with the Department of Labor, to talk more about the way that they see retirement and that relationship here between, the way we're thinking about this and they are. And I certainly know, as I said, Carolyn and Melissa have spent a lot of time on this. The terminology that we use, and to Desmond's point, how we measure this, because we're trying to encourage a habit. We're not necessarily targeting on a number, which is maybe a little bit different, again, of the way to think about this and again, how to measure it. So really appreciate your insights into it. And this is the beginning of the conversation with all of you today rather than the end. So we're going to certainly iterate on this, and as things come to you and as opportunity to partner on even particular research efforts, the opportunity to do that with all of you would be fantastic too. So thank you.
Well, thank you. We could probably spend a week on each one of these, but unfortunately, we don't have that kind of time. Our next discussion is going to be on the Bureau's research agenda, as if we haven't already been talking about that. But Jason Brown's going to stay to lead this discussion, so.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to thank the ARC and the members very much for your insights and wisdom and willingness to partner with us. I'm new to the agency, and it's just a real benefit as a researcher to have the dedication of excellent outside researchers to work with us. The disclaimer that Caroline did not read also applies here in this session as well. So the Dodd-Frank Act does require the Bureau to conduct research, and I'll just go over what the Dodd-Frank Act mandates us to do. That's to report on developments in the markets for consumer financial products or services, access to fair and affordable credit for traditionally underserved communities, consumer awareness, understanding, and use of disclosures and communications regarding consumer financial products or services, and likewise consumer awareness and understanding of costs, risks, and benefits of those products and services, consumer behavior with respect to consumer financial products and services, including performance on mortgage loans and experiences of traditionally underserved consumers, including the unbanked and underbanked. Likewise, we work with the Office of Financial Education to conduct research related to consumer financial education and counseling. So we do have a research agenda that governs a good deal of the research that we do. It was established in 2014 for a 5-year cycle, so we're nearing the end of that, or we are at the end of that original research agenda. And we had 2 focal areas, the dynamics of household balance sheets, which is a fairly broad research area, and disclosure, which of course is of great importance to the Bureau. We had a pretty thorough governance process for deciding on projects under the research agenda. So we would generate ideas either through working groups, within the Bureau and talking with others outside the Bureau. It could be research projects could be commissioned by the Office of Research Management, and the staff would often propose ideas through a call for proposals. We collect the proposals through an annual call for papers, and then we'd have a pretty thorough review process. So we'd have panels composed of members of the ARC, visiting scholars, leadership in the Bureau. These panelists were selected on the basis of subject matter expertise, and then they would review the proposals. So finally, we would decide on the final projects. We talked a little bit about in the last session some of the research inputs that we use on Start Small, Save Up, but we have generally available as our existing data assets, which are extremely rich, as we've talked about, the Consumer Credit Panel being a good example of that. Bureau developed surveys like the Making Ends Meet survey that we pair with our existing data assets. External data, we get proprietary data, administrative data, survey data, and then data developed through field trials and laboratory experiments. And so our output, we have a range of outputs. So we'll do reports on policy relevant questions. We'll do research reports on developments in credit markets, studies with outside partners, non-technical issue briefs, and independent research. And of course, that's in addition to the rulemaking and statutory required work that we do. We've been trying to drum up some new research agenda topics, and we're really interested in your thoughts on these and others, but I'll just go through them briefly just to set up the discussion. We just talked about emergency savings and Start Small, Save Up. We've also been thinking about consumer resilience in the face of financial challenges, empowering consumers and disclosure. So we already have the disclosure, but we can think more broadly about how consumers use information. How do they access information to make decisions? Consumer injury and consumer harm, which I know we're going to talk about in a little bit, access to credit, and then discrimination in credit markets. So we've got some discussion questions here to kind of guide us through the conversation, but basically we're interested in your thoughts on where do you think are some, the gaps in knowledge that we should be focused on. Do you have some ideas on our sort of research project selection process? How should we be using sort of the rich assets we have, our lab capabilities? Should we be collecting other data? And then finally, what role can all of you play in the selection and development of our research projects? So with that, I'll sort of open it up.
Well, Jason, the coin of the realm in the academic world is peer-reviewed academic papers, and they're very narrow focused by design because we can't answer all questions in one single research paper. And I don't know to the extent that you can follow or emulate that peer review process internally, because you can knit together a series of narrowly focused research topics to build a mosaic of results. And the other thing, I just, you'll be tired of hearing me say this probably by the end of the day, but I do think that academics can partner with the Bureau if we have data. Data is the driver for the research studies that academics do, and so you can outsource some of this research by just providing data to let the worldwide network of scholars run with the data.
Thank you, and I should have mentioned we actually do have ongoing partnerships with academics through our IPA program. I think we have about 8 or 9 academics who are part-time, basically, who are attracted by our data, and that we do get to work with.
What's IPA?
I was going to say that.
Yeah.
Intergovernmental personnel. I'm sorry. Personnel. Yeah. Agreement.
I would piggyback on what you're saying, Tom, too, because it is something that, as we formulate this research agenda, as we make the research agenda publicly known, too, I'm looking at our ability to have a much more robust, academic relationship network, if you will, to the point, and Jason's, definitely supports this, obviously, in terms of how we go about this, and data being a key part of it. I do get that. That's where those IPAs come into play too, because we have to make sure some of this data is proprietary, needs to be protected, how you protect it, and it's not quite the same ability to just, put the data out there widely, but certainly where we can, we want to, and where we have access to data that others don't, figuring out how we can more easily have these relationships. Because the IPA, similar to even the setting up of an RCT and having an agreement with a particular employer about that each time you try to start that new relationship, there's a lot of effort and back and forth that goes into it. So trying to figure out how we can replicate that, how we can speed that up, and how we can network that so that a lot of that upfront and important but bureaucratic steps can be sped up a little bit to get the work done.
I have a couple of suggestions on important research gaps, kind of inspired by your list. But on the question of consumer resilience in the face of financial challenges, I have seen a couple of one-off papers that have tried to do kind of stress testing of households, like you see stress testing of financial institutions. But this is just getting at the question of kind of, are they in a sustainable position? And kind of the idea of developing a standard framework for thinking about, could they withstand a shock to, their employment, or a healthcare shock, or something, long-term care shock. I feel like that could just shed a lot of light on whether people have enough saving or access to credit. And I think you're really well positioned to do it, just because you're here in this community, this policy community, where people have done so much research about what a healthcare shock looks like, or what an employment shock, what sorts of social insurance would they have to kind of offset that shock, but what do they need in terms of their own resources. So kind of some sort of stress testing could be really interesting. The other thing I wanted to comment on was access to credit. And access to credit and saving. We talked a lot in the last session about saving to buffer emergencies, and we talked about saving for retirement, but we've only really just kind of touched on economic mobility. And I think that's a question that's related to saving and also access to credit. So I feel like a lot of the research that goes on in the economic mobility sphere doesn't look at financial access, and a lot of the financial research that goes on doesn't think about economic mobility and their scope to bring those worlds together. But, obviously kind of having some saving or access to credit can facilitate investing in education. Everyone understands that. But, other examples, would be starting a business, being able to move to a place where there are better jobs, being able to move to a place where there are better skills. There are all sorts of linkages there, and I just don't feel like kind of we talk enough about that as kind of the benefits to saving and also benefits to access to credit.
Jason, can I ask a really basic question that maybe everyone in the room knows the answer to, but that's never stopped me from asking a question before. I'm sort of thinking about new data areas, and there's a lot of talk about, and we've touched upon a couple of the survey data assets that you have, but for sort of a newbie to what you have and don't have in terms of data assets, can you do a sort of 2-minute, here's what we got in terms of existing data assets? Because I think it's sort of useful to get the map to start thinking about where gaps might be, or where you think the gaps are.
I might invite some of my colleagues who've been working on this data more than I have, but just briefly, we have this consumer credit panel, which is I think a 1 in 48 sample of consumer credit records. We've paired that with, like I said, so it's got credit records, but it doesn't have things like income or a lot of demographic information. So this is why we think about augmenting that with survey data that can kind of fill in some of those gaps. We have the National Mortgage Database, which is a partnership with FHFA. Again, it's sort of a sample of mortgages. And then the sort of the trying to think of other ones. I invite any of my
Credit,
colleagues.
credit. So the third big database we have is the credit card database. Well, actually, and also we have Y14 data, both that the Fed is sharing with us, both credit cards and mortgages, and that's also. So these are all micro data, loan level, account level data on credit cards. In the case of credit cards, and mortgages in the case of the Y14 data.
Could I just, this is, I think, piggybacking on Karen's point about resilience. One of the things I think you're starting to that I think is really exciting is the idea of looking at financial well-being beyond the individual level and looking at the person and part of some social network, because people will sometimes rely on family and friends and so on as a source of resilience, and there are very interesting cross-cultural differences in the degree to which people do that, et cetera. And so actually, I was in some conversation with some of your folks yesterday afternoon, and I was very excited to hear the work that they're doing that's taking this more sociological, looking at the entire, the person's entire social network as a source of resilience.
And I would just, at a high level, just kind of piggyback off of the start small, save up statement. I mean, start small and build up in terms of the research program. You're a relatively young agency. In my experience, you're going to receive a lot of pressure, a lot of political pressure to do bold things before you may have the answers necessary to boldly impact public policy in a meaningful way. And in my experience, a lot of the challenges that we face at the FTC stem from years and years of policies that have been immortalized in legal proceedings and rulemaking that are difficult to change once new information comes into play. And I think that the best example I can think of here is the last session we're going to have today is how do you measure consumer injury or consumer harm? How do you measure, as Karen was talking earlier, how do you measure consumer well-being? I mean, those are fundamental questions. And it's just, it's mind-boggling to me that as a consumer protection agency that we would contemplate serious policies that are going to impact consumers for generations without knowing the answers to those seemingly small questions, right? So I think you're asking exactly the right questions. And I would also just add that, it's understandable that a young agency is going to want to start having an impact on public policy to protect consumers. But it's like the PhD student that comes into my office with the idea of a dissertation topic that is just so broad, like how do we save the world economically? I mean, yeah, that's a great question, but let's tackle something small that we can move the needle in a positive direction. And I know you face a lot of pressure. I know you have laudable goals, but I just would encourage you to not be afraid to fund or devote resources to those seemingly small questions like, what is consumer injury? How do we measure financial well-being? That's not going to lead to an immediate payoff in terms of some regulation or some policy or some enforcement decision, but it's going to ensure that future generations of consumer protectors base their policies on scientifically sound answers.
Josh, to step in to maybe give a little more context on your question, which is what data do we have and then how do we use it? A little over a year ago, we did a comprehensive internal review at the Bureau to categorize every type of data that we collect and then also explain our data governance policies, which include conditions on reuse within the agency, and also look at every MOU we have in place for the sharing of data external to the Bureau with our other state and federal partners, et cetera. And we released a public report, which we're happy to provide copies to you all and to the public as well, that was a couple hundred pages basically explaining every type of collection source that we have, the type of information that we take in and retain, the conditions on its use, so privacy restrictions or trade secrets restrictions that attach to it, how we use the data internally, how we reuse the data internally, and then a comprehensive a group of appendices that was really a data inventory. So every source of data that we have warehoused and a description of what it is and what you can get at. So happy to get you all a copy of that, which is really the comprehensive view on what we have and how we use it.
I'll add that while the agency or the Bureau may be relatively new, the work that you're doing intersects with decades of research, often in many of these agendas. So while knowledge and information can be refined over time, the work is connected to kind of long and rich histories and evidence bases. And I would just raise up the possible agendas to include access to credit again. Also to think of the ways that all different types of data are being used. So earlier there was a mention of the use of alternative data in underwriting, and I think there are possibilities for that as well as potential harms for that. And given what sounds like partnerships with fintech and business and financial institutions that use that alternative data or have the ability to scrape that alternative data from a variety of sources, I would be very, very curious to know kind of the effects of those technologies and those processes on consumers. And when I think of consumers that are in need of protection from harm, I think of those that are kind of like at the forefront of being kind of most detrimentally affected from those harms. So lower income groups, groups in rural communities, Black and brown communities, women. Women are increasingly heads of households and managing finances and taking care of kids, and also, they're folks in retirement. So as you think about these agenda topics, I would also encourage you to think about the kind of the social identities of the populations or the consumers and how that kind of intersects with the agenda, the access to credit or disclosures that they may be confronted with.
I have a suggestion or an idea that I think comes out of some FTC experience on particular projects. And we talked a lot about RCTs, and I think Mike earlier said, where we can do those, great, but there are natural experiments out in the world if we sort of look for them. I think Terry raised the Michigan, the state law change as one of those. I think thinking ahead about, you've got unique access to, through partnerships and through your own data assets, to all sorts of data around consumer behavior. Oftentimes for the natural experiments, it's variation in state or local law that generates the identification for the study. One would think that maybe the comparative advantage for compiling panels of changes in state law over time would be with law professors. They don't do it. Sort of hardly ever in these areas. And so it's one of the places where I think, I'm thinking about sort of not competition side state law variation studies the FTC has done on issues ranging from non-competes to state franchise laws to there was a study they did about the effects of interstate wine shipment before the Supreme Court had a case. Really influential stuff, got decided in the Supreme Court, impacted the change in the law. And I think an intuitive reaction would be the investment into sort of cataloging state law and tracking over time would be one that maybe wouldn't be your comparative advantage because someone else is doing it. And you can sort of pull that data off the rack when it happens, or you just sort of, by looking out your window, know when there's a natural experiment in a state that sort of changes the law in a way you can exploit to study something. I'm willing to bet with some thought and design, it may well be worth investing resources into tracking some particular dimensions of state law that impact consumer behavior in ways that complement and touch upon the Bureau's mission, it may well be worth investing in creating those databases yourself in some of those areas. I don't have specific ideas for which ones, but you know, that's where the natural experiment tend to live on some of these issues is state by state variation over time. And you know, the RCTs are important because they get us identification. This is another way to get identification, and you know, I think is probably worth thinking about.
One other suggestion, since we've been talking a lot about interacting with the academic community, I think there would be value in your Office of Research promulgating a list of research priorities. If we're talking about interacting with the academic community, right now my impression is it happens on kind of a one-off basis, so you know somebody who knows you, and then therefore it happens. But another model, if you're willing to, if it's possible to do the matchmaking process, is you promulgate a set of priorities. By the way, you can use your other advisory groups to help you with what those priorities might be. There are things that, and then when you promulgate those and distribute those to the academic world, then you try to do a matchmaking thing, and we would come to you because if we thought we had a differential advantage and you had something that could help us. So doing that. Reaching out to the academic community on a more public basis would have value, I would think.
So are you suggesting just giving out a sort of almost a list of ideas or things that we're interested in, or is it sort of more formal, like a grant process, or?
So I'm the only person. I'm a marketing professor. There's this amazing organization in my field called the Marketing Science Institute, which is this academic industry partnership. And these very thoughtful people from industry come together and they say, what are issues that are happening in marketing that they need frameworks for? And they're not just a one-off thing. That a lot of people have that. And then that leads to this priority generation process, and they promulgate this in the academic community. And people, and they, by the way, well, their thing is they give both matchmaking to get data and small grants. But that idea, they have a much wider net as a consequence of doing that. So it's not just if you work at school X and you know this person on CFPB, that you're in the set.
I think that's a brilliant idea, John. And just to be clear, it's not clear that this costs the Bureau anything. I mean, to the extent that the value you provide is data and individuals with institutional knowledge. And there are a lot of particularly young researchers that have incredibly impressive skill sets. The scarce resource they don't have is data and institutional knowledge, right? So that it's a win-win, I believe. It costs you nothing.
We have two ways in which we interact with academics, and I think you're right, John. It's somewhat ad hoc. One is, as we mentioned, the IPAs, and there we're bringing people in as part-time employees of the Bureau, either for pay or not for pay. But in a number of instances, some of our economists have partnered with outside academics to jointly do research papers, and that's another way in which we're able to. I think probably we keep the data here, but we're still able to work together with somebody and leverage their expertise and produce original research there that I think is quite useful. So I'll have the floor. Josh, to your point, I think it's a great point. One thing, just one paper that two of our economists have recently done was to exploit variations or changes in state debt collection laws, where what we wanted to do was to understand, there was not looking at consumer behavior, but actually firm behavior, to understand to what extent changes in debt collection laws affected access and price of credit. So our credit card database has pricing data in it on the price of credit cards. And by comparing states which had changes, and there, to point Tom made at one point, by relying on our markets folks were able to, we didn't have the database you talked about, but our markets folks were able to say, look, these states made changes in these laws that were material to the way the collection industry went about doing their practices, so that if you're going to find variations, if you looked in those states and compared them to other states that are otherwise comparably situated where there weren't those changes, and two of our economists produced a paper which we relied on in the debt collection rulemaking, and which they've presented at various academic conferences, and I think have submitted to some peer-reviewed journals as well.
I think pretty highly of the CFPB's research efforts and your abilities to partner with academics. I appreciate John's suggestion about like systematically reaching out so that there are entry points for others, maybe without some of those connections, that they are able to join in and kind of participate in some of these activities. But I mean, it strikes me as kind of asking the question back to you of how we can be helpful to you in advancing the work that you're already doing. I mean, I guess part of that is, maybe this conversation, but, maybe there are other specific ways.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. We will take whatever you can give us in terms of. No, I mean I mean we are mindful that you're very busy. But in the past we have relied on the ARC to kind of help review some research project ideas. Obviously, we're here asking you for thoughts on coming up with a research agenda. But yeah, so we're very sort of interested in any ideas you have on how you think you can be helpful to us, being mindful of your competing responsibilities.
Can I push you a little harder on the question of increasing academic access to your data resources? And we talked about this a little bit at breakfast, but I understand entirely why you can't open up access to kind of the micro data that you have. I mean, the privacy issues, the legal issues, the just your resource constraints. But as Josh was saying, a lot of the action is in terms of natural experiments is kind of at the state level, and there is research that is being done in the academic community that looks at either state level data or kind of county level data where you have a change in state policy, but what you want to do is you want to look at two counties that are kind of just across the line from each other, so you can compare those two because presumably they're very similar in other ways. And I don't know about your ability to kind of release kind of roll-ups of the data. So for example, the New York Fed they released a little bit of their consumer credit panel at the state level. It's just kind of student loans. It's a limited number of years. It's only annual data. And I just don't know. I mean, I know you have limited resources and you're going to have your priorities, but I feel like the conversation could be greatly enriched if kind of someone were releasing data along their lines, because it's just such little data to kind of research these questions out there. And I think the better research will always be done inside the agency with the micro data, but kind of just being able to kind of release it out there and set some roll-ups out there and set it free might then just spark a lot of kind of creativity in the community, people thinking they're finding patterns that then may generate kind of real research projects for you down the road.
The one data asset you might look at, Karen, the one time we have put out microdata, actually a subset of data from the National Mortgage Database. The National Mortgage Database, which is it's a nationally representative sample of all mortgages in existence. From that, we survey each quarter new borrowers. People who newly take out a mortgage and obtain data from that, and that's a longitudinal survey we've been doing for 8-12 quarters, I'm not sure, done jointly with FHFA. And last year we put out a public use data set which uses the NSMO, the National Survey of Mortgage Origination data, and includes some administrative data, some of the variables from the administrative data along with that, and that's available as a public use data set for any researcher to use.
Yeah, and I should have acknowledged that. I mean, it's huge because just the data to study, these are such important questions, but the data that's available to just researchers who don't have some relationship with a financial services company or kind of are inside some agency that has deep pockets and can buy these data, it's huge when you do something like that. It really makes a huge difference.
The other thing you're able to do, like the issue of understanding financial behavior, like one sector, is always, the ability to understand that is hindered by not knowing the entire balance sheet. And so anything that you have that allows one to pair data about what's going on, say with mortgages, with other aspects of the person's financial life would be huge, because there is this substitution effect across areas.
John, let's put you on the spot. Suppose you had a bunch of postdocs who came to you and said, we have money, don't worry about the money, to do any kind of laboratory work, field work that you think is important. What would you like us to do to be most valuable to your research or to the field of understanding consumer decision making? Do you have any sort of top candidates of things directions you might point them in?
Well, I think one is something that's come up already. Like it's this relationship between these different categories of savings. I think that's a super important thing, and I think that deserves more research. So I'd let other people chime in theirs.
I think, David, you described like maybe an academic's dream of a team of researchers.
And that's why we have you here.
postdocs.
Your academics
Right.
dream for us. Tell us what we got all those people out there who are at your service and all this data, and money's not an object. What would you do with it?
I think I would go back to the question about kind of digital data, I suppose. I think there are things that are happening with data that given our technologically advancing society, I think, and the use of artificial intelligence and connecting that with finance, I think is maybe like a decade or two beyond kind of the research agendas, at least that I am thinking about, or that many of us are like trained to address. And these are things that are happening in real time and advancing in their applications pretty quickly in different markets. And I would wish for a team that would look at some of those kind of rapidly advancing technological changes and their impacts on consumers. But that's more of maybe the kind of the 30,000-foot question. I mean, there are a series of small incremental steps that can be taken underneath that. But in terms of that trend, I think it's important to be at least considering, I think we're already kind of behind the forefront of that, but definitely have it on our agendas.
I think, we've been, talking about what, we as outsiders can bring to the table. You've got a number of, economists and social scientists within the Bureau that are doing fantastic work, and I would advocate the Bureau ensuring that you're allowing those individuals to go to professional conferences in their fields, to have conversations with academics, because a lot of these partnerships that we're talking about, they don't need to be top-down ways of happening. You can get those engagements by having your staff have conversations. And once the hungry academic looking for tenure at a university in a publish-or-perish world understands that you've got smart people with access to fantastic data, you're going to be doing more research than you can possibly handle. So.
I think this is definitely helpful. I couldn't agree with you more in terms of this being, there's some top down and bottom up. And I think, to your point, Terry, we have done some pretty fantastic research out of this organization. A lot of that really has been some bottom up work. And I think to John's point, something that I'm particularly interested in is understanding how we support both. Certainly, I think we have given and will continue to give opportunities to our economists to get out there and to harness their ideas and their passions around different topics, because that's what's going to help get some of these things going. But that more systematic way to do this as well, so that there is some top down, that we're kind of putting out our research challenge to the world, or the areas where we see gaps. And I think something that I've heard here today, and something that I've heard in I've had a couple other outreach sessions with academics as I've been out and about. Jason and I did one in Chicago not too long ago too, and I will say that the data is a huge part of this. So I also appreciate your point, Karen, about how we can think about what we can make available, and from my involvement in general in government, it's what we can make available over time too, and make that commitment to continue to make it available, so that there's an opportunity for repeatable experiments, or things that look at things over the time horizon too, which I took from the prior conversation. So I certainly challenge the staff to be thinking about that as you're all sitting there listening to us, to be thinking about what perhaps ways that we can make some of these things available, what there is, so that we can share that. We haven't talked much, I mean, again, getting back to some of the research topics that Jason started with. And I think, Terry, you touched on it a little bit with access, but around discrimination in the marketplace too, and what kinds of things maybe you all have explored, what approaches we could take to that, what there is or is not. I think the other thing I would say is, we're looking at these topics, it's what we think needs greater exploration, or what perhaps there is a decent body from your experience of research out there on some of these various topics. That might be an interesting way to wrap us up for a couple minutes.
David, since you gave us a great big credit card, I think, when I was a senior associate dean at St. Louis U, one of my jobs was to facilitate research by the faculty and just eliminate any problems that they would have, except for, they still have to teach classes and whatnot, but I would say just organically, these research topics will flow if people are given the opportunity for data and for grants. And actually, a big idea would be, why not start a new journal in this field somehow? Since you got, we have this data, money's not a problem. Let's have a new journal of current topics, or something that the Bureau can help steer, and you have economists to serve on the advisory board, and you can have other academics be, editorial board, et cetera. But I think that it's hard to mandate top-down research. I think it just kind of swells up from, academics chase data, and they have pinpoint questions that they follow the scientific method, but then you put all that collection of knowledge together, and you can build sound policy.
Let me just jump in real quick to elaborate a little more on the genesis of the research agenda, and why is there a research agenda? I mean, I think there was a desire to think sort of long term, like how do we prioritize the research we do, and there were also a couple of sort of other motivating factors with those specific research agendas. The dynamics of household balance sheets. The Bureau was receiving this incredibly rich data, and I think wanted to have some way of thinking about how to sort of make the most of it and how to use it. And so there came that one agenda. And likewise, the Bureau was beginning to think about how do we set up our lab and field work. And so the disclosure agenda was a way of kind of harnessing that. But if I understand you correctly, Tom, you're sort of thinking that maybe there doesn't need, we have an agenda set by the Dodd-Frank statute and just sort of leave it at that, let a thousand flowers bloom. That's one approach. I guess the other, though, is that should the Bureau have some priorities that it really wants the staff to focus on. And I should also sort of point out that we do have independent research that takes place that is within this broader sort of umbrella of consumer finance that's not sort of Bureau directed.
Wonder if I could follow up with one of the specific topics here, especially because it relates so closely to our regulatory agenda, where we often are faced with choices as to whether to prohibit behavior or to mandate disclosures as an alternative. Are there cutting edge issues in related to disclosures and consumer financial research that would be worth the Bureau spending time and effort to study?
You please, no, please. Lights on, and not me. The issue with disclosures is people not reading them is one piece, and then the issue of the limited effects that they have. And so, one of the main behavioral areas of research related to all this has to do with whether people can be can you get information overload, and is it the case that people don't use information because it's part of some larger set, and therefore, and the placement of where it occurs is such that by the time, if it's at the end of some long financial prospectus, for example, have people worn out on that? And so you do have actually a pretty interesting agenda in that arena. Like, one of the things you're doing that I think is important is to consider the effects of disclosures not just on the consumers themselves, but also on the sellers, and how does requiring a certain kind of disclosure change the behavior of sellers in ways that might be helpful. So I'm actually pretty impressed with the agenda you have around that disclosure topic.
Well, it's glad that I let you speak first, because it kind of dovetails nicely. I was gonna basically suggest what John did, that disclosures in and of themselves information is not a bad thing. I've never heard an economist to suggest, other than asymmetric information problems, but generally information is a good thing, not a bad thing. The problem is that I think about the mortgage disclosure study the FTC did and looked at the method in which those disclosures were taking place, and the fact that government mandated disclosures weren't communicating information to consumers. I think it's like 80% of the consumers didn't even know what the annual percentage rate was on their mortgage, whether they were going to have to pay a prepayment penalty if they. So I mean, it's not clear that disclosures are necessarily a panacea. Right. I think, and so you've got this tension as an economist. On the one hand, I'm an advocate of giving consumers information. On the other hand, like you guys, every time I download an app, I click accept. I don't read those darn disclosures. And so what would be really interesting is to do some type of retrospective study to try to understand in the disclosure space, have there been instances in which disclosures have materially impacted consumers in a positive way? And I mean, I know of no study that has done that. And so that's just retrospective studies generally might help you understand whether some of these things that on the surface an economist is going to say a great thing to do are really generating any benefits.
If I can jump in, I had one question for our members here today, which relates to the research agenda, but not directly. It doesn't directly get to the question of what should we study. It gets instead to how do we maximize the utility of the research that we are doing. And what comes to mind is in April, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs put out updated information quality guidance, which instructed departments and agencies to try and pay careful attention to the research they're putting out to improve its quality, but also looking to try and ensure that the research that the government's issuing is or can be made subject to peer review, which implies an ability to share the data that underlies the analysis and share to the maximum extent possible the methodology used by a particular agency in doing so. And so one question that comes to mind for us from a research perspective is, to the extent we're committing to conduct research in a particular area, we ought to think about the type of information that we're using to conduct that research, because there may be restraints on our ability to disclose that information later on, which may constrain academics on the outside in their ability to actually build on the research that we're issuing, to the extent that they can't understand the methodology or can't obtain access to the information that we used in the first instance to build on the research. So I guess my question is, to what extent do you all find that important for purposes of peer review? What are the considerations that, ex ante that we should have in terms of thinking about the type of information we're using to inform our research, and how we can maximize the utility for outside researchers on ex post to build on the research that we've done, so it's not just simply a single report at a point in time that is quickly forgotten, but that can form a basis for continued research and activity on the research topic.
Well, I think the peer review process results in really good work, because everybody who's published a peer-reviewed paper knows what you've published isn't what you started out with, and the referees will be, they're obviously just pernicious and mean-spirited and everything. But at the end of the day, it does sharpen the research, and it makes it replicable and reliable. So I encourage peer review. I don't how to do that, I'm not sure. I mean, we know that when we submit to a journal, the referees are chosen by the editor, and it's double blind. We don't know who they are. Although in the days of the internet, you post one of your papers on the internet, the referee says, oh, it's this guy. But I think the process is pretty reasonable, and it's rough. I mean, those referees are rough on you, but it sharpens the result at the end of the day.
So I'm going to respond to Brian's question, but first turn back to what Director Kraninger mentioned with regard to discrimination in credit markets, and raise that as an important agenda topic, especially given rising income and wealth inequality, and what that means for limited economic mobility that Karen mentioned, and the ways in which credit is changing, that be an important topic. And then can I clarify your question, Brian? Is what I hear you saying is sometimes you can't disclose the full methodology of the data that you have. Is that, and does that limit academic participation in the peer review process? Is that?
Yeah, so to the extent there are limits on the type of information we can disclose or a methodology employed, does that limit in some way the utility of the research itself for researchers looking at that particular study and trying to build on it? And to the extent that there is a limitation, how much of that should we care about, and should we build that into our research agenda at the outset? So is it relevant to our consideration of which topics to study, and would particular limitations on the later publication of that data, should that be relevant to the topics that we're choosing from among a very varied kind of universe of potential topics for research?
And Terry, I think the issue is, it's more about we can't put out the data itself. So it's rare that we can't describe what we did with the data, but if we describe what we did with data, but the data is not out for anybody else to be able to replicate it, knowing, they can say that you can find methodological flaws, but you can't actually test to make sure that what we did actually was done well, and without being able to see the data. And that's where we run into these issues, I think, more than the methodology itself.
The actual replication of the exact data that you use.
I think that's fair, right, Brian? I don't want to.
I think I see increasingly in peer-reviewed journals the request to include your data in the publication of that, but I also don't think that is 100% widespread. There are specific places where it's important to do that, and would limit kind of work in those areas where it is important, but not full scale, and not across all academic disciplines, is my experience with that.
Yeah, just building on what Terry said, I think there's peer review, which is really important, but that's the issue about being able to replicate it is a kind of separate issue. And I just think in the economic space, we are increasingly moving towards people doing work with proprietary data and getting really important, really interesting results. And I think kind of researchers accept that as a trade-off. That in an ideal world, the data would be out there and everyone would be able to kind of try to replicate your results. But I think it's like perfectly within kind of what's normal in the profession right now to have people doing work on important questions with really good data, and this be recognized as good, high quality research because it's gone through a peer review process, but not necessarily sharing the data.
Brian, it's a fantastic question. I mean, I would just say in terms of the sort of ex-ante research agenda design, the thing to think about from my perspective, and echoing some of where Karen was landing there, this is a portfolio of work, right? It's not, there's going to be a paper where you can't do peer review because you can't disclose the data, and there's going to be 8 others that are okay to go through the peer review process. And the agency's research agenda and team and staff get a bunch of capital. Right, the intellectual capital of the agency increases because you're doing peer-reviewed work, you're making academic partnerships with you're sort of part of the academic community. And I think that there's sort of positive externalities that flow from the publication of these other things that go through peer review. So when you put out the thing that's, you do the important work first, and if you can't share it because you can't share it, if it's in a sort of a fleet of work, I think the most important thing is to do the work and share to the extent you can. And I think it's perfectly fine that some of that, especially certainly true in the economic spaces I work in, that it's pretty common now for a lot of papers to depend on some form of proprietary data. But I do think that's right, sort of in terms of it is a thoughtful observation that you have about kind of thinking about what that agenda looks like as a whole. Because if it's 8 pieces where you can't put anything into peer review ever, right? And it's 3 years between the next 2 CFPB peer-reviewed publications, I think that the trade-off sort of probably cut the other way.
The other thing to link that discussion to the earlier one about collaborating with academics. Academics coin in the realm is publishing in top journals. Some journals have policies that are around data sharing that will allow for certain exceptions, but increasingly there's this so-called replication crisis in the biomedical and the social sciences, and so people want to know that things are replicable. Mm-hmm. And so that has led, in some cases, the lack of replicability is due to outright fraud, and that's led to part of why, like in my field, there's a big movement toward posting your data and posting your instruments and so on. One of the things, though, if you have proprietary data, it's pretty sure that there's not outright fraud in the data themselves, and so I would imagine that journals would be more accommodating to you in believing that there's not been something improper done with the data themselves if the data can't be shared in their entirety.
Appreciate all of your response. It's been a fantastic session. And at this point, we will adjourn modulo my apology to Chris Mafarage, who's, I noticed as I was looking down at Karen, I realized I didn't introduce you, and I apologize for that, and oversight on my part. Chris is a senior advisor to the deputy director, so great to have you participate. So with that, we will adjourn for lunch and look forward to reconvening after lunch. Well, thank you all. Welcome back. Great to see you folks back as well. We're now going to start the last session of the day, and I'm pleased to welcome a couple of folks in the Bureau that are going to talk about defining consumer harm and consumer injury. And in my opinion, it's an incredibly important task in protecting consumers, is to make sure we're measuring harm right, because that's going to reflect the potential benefits of the enforcement or policies that we put in place. I'd like to welcome back Jason Brown, who's the Assistant Director for the Office of Research. And I'd like to welcome Paul Rothstein, Section Chief for Financial Institutions and Regulatory Policy for the Office of Research. Appreciate you taking the time to enlighten us, Paul, and turn it over to you folks.
Thank you very colorblind. Thank you very much. So, good, standard disclaimer. All right, so thank you for proposing this session. The Dodd-Frank Act and one of the states that one of the primary functions of the Bureau is to identify risks to consumers in markets for consumer financial products and services. We've discussed this a few times today, but just to note, these financial products and services include most consumer credit products, certain savings products, and certain services related to consumer credit like debt collection and loan servicing and the payment system. Dodd-Frank cites risks to consumers as a reason or factor to be considered in many specific Bureau activities, including market monitoring, supervision, research, and the size of civil penalties. And Dodd-Frank also cites benefits to competition along with substantial consumer harm as a factor to be considered in evaluating whether an act or practice is unfair. So the Bureau routinely enforces consumer law and further seeks and obtains a variety of monetary remedies for violations of these laws. Dodd-Frank raises questions about risks and consumer harms, and the Bureau continues to consider these issues in our day-to-day work. The Bureau has never articulated a fully general definition of what consumer harm is. The FTC and state AGs have considered consumer harm in enforcement and rulemaking for decades, in both defining and remedying unfair and deceptive acts and practices. So that's the initial setup through Dodd-Frank. In thinking about trying to ground this, I then thought, well, how about getting real specific in our space, a little bit of a contrast from the Federal Trade Commission space, and just really think about consumer credit here for a moment, because at the end of the day, it's not typically a one-and-done trade. It's a contract, and a lot goes on. So credit allows individuals to consume more than their income at certain times and then less than their income in others. The main purpose is, economists describe it as smoothing consumption. Credit cannot even be discussed without mentioning time, risk, or uncertainty. As with any transaction, at the moment of transaction, an individual may not obtain the best price available or the right amount for their needs. They may get too much, they may get too little, or fully understand the good or service. So relevant there is the information available at origination, search behavior, disclosure, of course, is very relevant to all of that. But then the story continues. So unlike many transactions, initial exchange is followed by subsequent exchange or exchanges, repayment, and possibly refinancing with their own risks and opportunities. So what's going on? Future income and individual circumstances are not fully known at origination. Certain features of credit products, such as adjustable rates, balloons, repricing mechanisms, back-end fees triggered by usage patterns, may make it difficult to predict how much is owed or how a consumer will manage what is owed. Additional actors, such as loan servicers, debt collectors, may be involved with a mix of contractual and private incentives, which also raises sort of principal and agent considerations. What is the relationship of the creditor to the debt collector, the servicer, principals and agents? It's a whole nother set of issues when you start to think about credit. The result can be a range of negative financial and non-financial outcomes. So in specific terms, we think about delinquency, default, foreclosure, loss of access to the credit system. These are the nouns that we use to describe concrete kinds of and countable kinds of harms. And in some of the, for example, the health literature, you've got computation of things like the value of a statistical life as how to think about the risks of these negative outcomes. And one could think about computing measures like the value of a statistical foreclosure avoided or delinquency avoided in a similar kind of framework. But these are the tangible, countable things. There's also more general kinds of harms that we often talk about in this work. Financial distress. Failure to smooth consumption, misallocation of household resources. These are a bit less tangible, but again, are part of our vocabulary. And then there are the downstream consequences for health and family that can occur with particularly negative outcomes with credit. So, not to debate whether these are negative, it's more about, are all of these negative outcomes necessarily consumer harms within one of the disciplines that all of you bring to the table here. One way to address that would be to focus on that discipline and ask about that. So think about economic harm, legally recognized harm, policy relevant harm, and ultimately all of that is relevant. But in setting up this session, we thought that it would be useful to solicit from you just your view of these from the disciplines that you come from, and take what we characterize here as an open and inductive approach to defining consumer harm. And so then the questions that we get to are designed to elicit your thinking about consumer harms. We really want to hear from you, and really hope that you can bring just your perspective without worrying about what box it may or may not fall into at this point, in thinking about how you define these harms and how you go about measuring them. And so beginning with the personal in your own work. So we have 4 questions, and I do want to get to all 4 because I think all 4 touch on a different part of the question. So I'm going to watch the time, but I hope you'll all jump in on every one. So first, have you defined or measured consumer harms associated with consumer financial products or services in your own research or other professional work? And if so, how have you done this, and what data have you relied on? So think about your own research and the outcomes that you've measured, and some might be benefits which have allayed a harm or mitigated a harm, but you still have then harm as the central concept. There's sort of a mirror image there. And so a benefit, harm avoided, however you have framed it. And then we'd like to hear from each of you on this point. So with that, I will open the floor.
Okay, great, Paul. Thanks so much. I think this is a great opportunity for us to kind of just have an open conversation about the various things we do, because I know we all come from different areas within social science. So let me just begin with a couple of papers that I've written that I believe are relevant for this. And let me just initially say that the specific questions that I and my co-authors have attempted to address are very narrow questions. And I think one has to first of all recognize that how you're trying to measure the benefits or costs of a particular policy, or the more generally consumer utility, is going to depend upon the underlying environment in which you're doing it. So the first paper I'd like to talk about is a paper that John Morgan and I published in the American Economic Review. It was in the early 2000s at the dawn of the internet. And the question we were trying to address is, what's the value of information to online buyers of mortgages and other products as a result of information that's available about interest rates, prices, and so on the internet, right? And so in our simple framework, and I just want to stress that you've got to be very careful when you look in the academic literature and try to apply a particular methodology to a real-world problem. They're typically going to be very narrowly focused in the academic literature. The specific question we were examining was purely the impact of price information. Okay, no information, no issue of fraud, no issue of deception, no issues like that. Purely what's the value of price information that arises in a market. In our model, consumers had rectangular demand, and therefore the measure of consumer welfare was the difference between the price they would pay in a world of information versus a but-for world without the information.
Demand for what?
Could be a mortgage.
Just specifically mortgage.
A mortgage could be you're buying a consumer electronics product on the internet.
Right.
The leading example we used was mortgages. The data we had at that time, it's just casual empirical data, was mortgage data.
Okay.
Subsequently, we've published other papers that look at consumer electronics products and so forth. So that measure is just looking at, okay, what prices would consumers pay in a world with information? What prices would they pay in a world without information? And that difference, that differential, is a measure of the welfare associated with the movement to the information regime, or alternatively the harm that consumers would suffer if you moved away from the information regime. So that's one example. I've got another paper with Maria Abaskia that looks in more detail at online mortgage rate data from a company called mortgagequotes.com, which no longer exists. And we did a similar type of methodology there to look at the pure price issues.
And were you thinking in terms of, this was just relying on that data, so it wasn't like a formal search model, and that there was this?
Yeah, it's a formal equilibrium model.
Oh, it is, okay.
Of a platform that's in the business of offering price information to consumers. And so, a couple of things that come out of that, and I think this is an important thing to keep in mind as one is contemplating measuring harm. Our model explicitly recognized that there were multiple types of consumers who were able to access the price information, and then consumers who are on the wrong side of the digital divide who may not have access to that information, similar to the environment Terry is talking about. And there are differential welfare effects associated to the presence of information. It could benefit people on one side of the digital divide and harm people on the other side of the digital divide. And I think oftentimes in public policy, particularly when the CFPB or other consumer protection agencies put forth press releases talking about results, it's always kind of consumers benefited. My experience, some consumers may benefit from a policy, some consumers may be harmed. Like Terry's discussion at lunch, when we look at the impact of technological changes in online banking, people that are connected to the internet may get different advantages than people that are disadvantaged that live in rural areas and so forth. So I would encourage you to be thinking not only about how do you measure consumer harm, but whose consumer harm are you measuring, and are the effects identical for all consumers in the market? If not, how do you weigh the benefits to one group of consumers off against the potential harm to another group?
Just one clarifying question. So in your data, were the folk who were on the wrong side of the digital divide actually harmed, or they just didn't get as good a deal as the group on the right side?
It depends on which question you're asking about the value of information, but prices went up for people who did less searching.
Did less search. Yeah, okay. Thank you. Others?
I didn't want to interrupt anyone talking about their specific papers because I have something to say. Not that's sort of a more general point that I think at least is a little bit related. I know that at work, sort of both in the FTC capacity, at least, I think it's important just as a sort of framing mechanism. And this is more comment than anything else to think about the idea. I mean, there are different ways to think about consumer harm for the purposes of an agency. One might be, I need to know about the magnitude of the harm for sort of damages or fines or sort of deterrence calculation purposes, right? So the function might be there, and I might be really interested in measurement questions if that's the function of the harm inquiry. It might be a legal requirement, and so the thing I'm really interested in is there harm or not, right? And so I need I've got a more binary question, and so conceptually I'm interested in is there a difference in the consumer outcome with and without the behavior, the price difference in Mike's example, but whether it's some sort of unfair act or practice allegation or a deceptive allegation. I think the oftentimes, at least in FTC work, this takes the form of a materiality analysis of some sort. I need a difference in outcomes in the sort of in the counterfactual world. So what I really need are methods to sort of do counterfactual analysis. The magnitude is important, but less important for answering the binary question. And all sorts of measurements are okay. It could be price or output. It could be the types of direct harms that we've talked about in some other contexts, just sort of to demonstrate that the consumer is worse off in the world with the conduct than in the counterfactual. And sort of the third that comes to mind is just from the perspective of an agency economizing on scarce resources that depend to decide where it's going to spend its time, right? I want to know, there's behavior out there. If it looks really bad, but I put my sort of hands on the analysis of what happens with and without, right? I can get a sense of the rate of return of spending agency dollars on solving a problem. It is very difficult to do that without doing some sort of counterfactual analysis. Again, their measurement is going to matter more, but I think in a more conceptual way than if I'm doing sort of damages. And so, I mean, for a lot of these questions, I don't know, in my mind at least, when I think about the relevance of consumer harm and injury to what an agency like the CFPB does, it does all of those things, and all of those things are going to be important in different contexts. But I think kind of focusing in on the importance of counterfactual analysis, but is the broad overarching theme. But in what detail or with what measurement or exactly how you're going about doing that in a specific context depends a lot on whether you're talking about a specific enforcement action or rule or a high level prioritizing over where you're going to spend agency dollars. And I don't think that's even close to an answer to question one, but it's the first thing I'm thinking about in answering all the questions. And so I thought I'd say it because I have a microphone.
That's good, but just to press on that just a little, we are very much in a space where, you know, the facts and circumstances of a matter kind of determine, as a practical sense, what our conception of harm is and then how well we can measure it. I'm just speaking within my office, RMR. I'm not talking about enforcement here, but I did enforcement at the FTC, so I was the same there too. I don't know that that's the world we necessarily have to be in. There can be a more worked out overarching methodology that we can dip into in practical ways, but to have that further developed would be very useful. And in these sorts of matters that we deal with here, where time and risk are so intrinsic all the time, it would be good to be able to move beyond comparative demand analysis of this that is very useful for certain kinds of harm analysis, but is not the complete story for the complicated products and world that we work with. I don't think. Next. Does anyone else want to speak to question one?
Sure. Thank you for posing such a broad and challenging question to us. I have a question in response, which is a little bit rhetorical, but I wonder to whom is the consumer that you are concerned about being harmed? So I would think I would weigh more heavily the consumers that may be already in jeopardy of having detrimental consequences of experiencing some sort of harm in my analysis. But I also I appreciate the question about in your own research or other professional work, are there other ways beyond economic measures of harm, I think perhaps is some of the question that's being raised here. And measuring that in financial or economic terms is one way to approach that question. I think there are mental health effects of some harms that consumers experience mental health effects from, such as depression, anxiety, and suicide as a result of carrying, for example, high-cost burdensome debt, which are pretty significant and severe harms that can be quantified, but in and of themselves, death seems like a pretty poor outcome of a harm. As a result of mental health considerations. But I appreciate the kind of the reserves regulatory framework for understanding or approving mergers, and they have a kind of 4 categories that they think about with regard to bank branch mergers and considering whether the consolidation of a bank could result, what kinds of outcomes could those be, and they consider different harms, things like competition, financial stability, if I can remember them all, public interest, and like managerial and maybe human resources effects. I think those are the 4 ways that they try and interpret and understand the effects of a bank merger. And anticipate any sorts of harms. And so it seems like applying various categories to understanding what types of harms could occur, economic, individual, consumer, broader market, and perhaps mental health effects or, or some sort of other category that you might consider weighing on those harms?
I'll just put it out as a general question. I'd be very interested in knowing how much quantification is done on each of those factors versus more qualitative or intuitive, as Josh was describing. And if
Yeah, I think the public interest one in particular is maybe where, and the human managerial kind of resources is where there's maybe more qualitative input. And the extent to which all of those categories are weighted equally, they're not all weighted equally in the analysis, but for example, public comments are things that are weighted in public interest, as are quantitative measures like CRA, potential CRA effects of mergers.
So this is great, Paul. I mean, I think it's terrific that you're pursuing it. It is really challenging, which means you get even more credit for doing it. I've not quantified harm in my own research. Just a couple of broad points, which is to the extent that you can capture, so having point estimates is important, but also kind of knowing what the confidence intervals are around those point estimates can be valuable. I mean, at the end of the day, you have to make a decision, which is presumably going to be factoring in some point estimate, but knowing how precisely estimated, how confident you are in the harms that you're measuring is important. And then just along those lines, that kind of a more specific point, that recognizing that statistical insignificance is very different from a precisely estimated zero. It's a corollary.
for the less technical, would you like to just unpack that just for a second?
The statistical insignificance, that you may, so we have ways to use statistics to determine, if you find, some estimate that harm is kind of on average going to be whatever, but if there's a lot of variability, you may decide you can't really precisely measure that. You can't determine that statistically that kind of your estimate, which suggests that there's positive harm, actually is a reliable estimate. So kind of understanding whether you've estimated harm and it's a very reliable estimate is very different from when there's so much noise in the data. Your program is kind of popping out a positive number, but you really don't know. It could be that number, but the confidence interval around that goes from some negative number to some number that's twice as large.
All right, we'll move on to the next question unless somebody wants to speak to this one. Very good. All right, so here's something very concrete, drawing on some of the Bureau's research, done actually pursuant to statutory requirements. So under Dodd-Frank, we have an obligation to conduct an assessment of our significant rules 5 years after they take effect, and we've completed 3 such assessments. One of those assessments was for the mortgage servicing rules that we had issued in 2013 and took effect in 2014. And these are large documents. I gave you chapter 4. These are intensely empirical documents in which we used really all available data we had in-house and collected some critical additional data. This particular couple of numbers actually come from a couple of data sets that we bought. These aren't like proprietary from mortgage servicers. We did use that as well, but this is McDash data and another source, which is to say that others could have done this analysis, but nobody ever saw fit to do it. Maybe it's expensive data, maybe not others really did. And that's another thing about being at the Bureau, is that sometimes we will use data that others in principle have available and could do these analyses, but for whatever reason just don't. And what we found here is that at least 26,000 additional borrowers who became delinquent in 2014 would have experienced foreclosure within 3 years of becoming delinquent had the rule not gone into effect in 2014, to the best of our ability to identify that. There's no natural experiment here. There's no RCT. What we had, though, was a lot of data from which we could then, monthly data, from which you could then start to pick out before and after effects of the rule, and control for other conflating factors. There were other things going on with mortgage servicing. There was a national mortgage settlement. Of course, there were trends in the macroeconomy. All of that we could control for, and then still look to see if there was something happening around the breakpoints that then created a persistent effect and affected the 3-year foreclosure rate, both before the rule took effect and after the rule took effect. For those who were not, technically for those who became 90 days delinquent. That was the start of this. And for those of you who don't know much about foreclosure and servicing data, it's actually surprising that you might think if somebody ever became 90 days delinquent in their mortgage, they were for sure going to get foreclosed or have to sell the house, or they would not be in the home 3 years later. In fact, in our data, that's a terrible outcome, and it happened to about half the people, but somehow the other half, that was not the outcome. Now, in our data, it didn't necessarily mean they cured. They might have prepaid or they might have dropped out of the data, but it's not as if it was a done deal and there wasn't anything one could do for such people. So in fact, we found 26,000 additional borrowers, to the best that we could identify, did not experience foreclosure because of the rule. And we also found that at least 127,000 fewer borrowers, because of the rule, who became delinquent, in this case only 30 days delinquent, not 90 days delinquent, would have recovered from delinquency within 3 years of becoming delinquent, so if not for the rule. So these are sizable effects, and but I put it out there both to show off some of the Bureau's work, but also to ask the question, do you view these effects as mitigation of a consumer harm within whatever lens you want to apply to thinking about that problem? I mean, obviously it's a nice outcome, but thinking more broadly about consumer harm, is this a mitigation of consumer harm as you want to think broadly about the mortgage process? Why or why not? And if so, can you suggest ways that the Bureau might monetize the value of this mitigation? Because we only took it up to counts. We didn't put dollar values for the consumers who were not foreclosed upon. These are the kinds of questions we have to wrestle with. So you can all go back to your universities, but we're still going to be here thinking about it. So let's hear.
Of course, living in an ivory tower, I'm not bashful. So I mean, I think I guess what I would say is that other things equal, this suggests that the rule improved consumer welfare, and the question then would become how much, if it's an other things equal question, right? So I'd want to know something about, I'm assuming that this 26,000 is the incremental number, and what's delinquency cost an individual versus a financial institution. I mean, there's two sides to a delinquency. It seems like to me, just thinking out of the blue here, that the welfare effects. I mean, welfare effects on both sides of the transaction. It might benefit some lenders. It might benefit some borrowers. And so I'd want to quantify that. I'd want to make sure that there weren't any unintended consequences of this rule. For example, I mean, you could create a rule such that no one is delinquent, but it might impose such onerous costs on banks and/or individuals that the number of people that actually get loans shrinks as a result of that. And so then I'd want to know, okay, well, what's the disutility a borrower gets that is deprived of a loan because of these more onerous rules, or because of the higher mortgage rates that a lender might charge to service a loan or whatever. And so there's just all those types of issues that you'd want to factor in. And I think, but the other things equal comparison is nice here, but it doesn't really shed light on whether it's a matter of public policy. The costs of that rule generated benefits sufficient to cover the cost, right, from a public policy standpoint. So I think it's not, I mean, we're dismal scientists, right? We're always pointing out all these, unintended consequences. But the reason for that is, presumably scarce taxpayer resources were put in place to make this happen. And you guys are competing with many other things that could be done to improve consumer welfare, right? And so the economic analysis is designed to quantify that in dollars so that we can compare the value of a dollar you spend on an action like this versus a dollar that might be spent hypothetically by the EPA to make the environment cleaner, right? And so it's hard to quantify the benefits of a clean environment or the benefits to a borrower from being less likely to be delinquent. But effective public policy, requires, and as I recall, you were in the FDA, weren't you, before you weren't, before you were at the FTC, you weren't at the FDA, okay. So, but they've got difficult problems there as well, I'll point out, so.
Just to clarify one point, the trade-off you mentioned, that's great. That's exactly the kind of open-ended point we want. But Dodd-Frank did provide for amendments to the mortgage servicing requirements in RESPA, and we wrote rules pursuant to that. So it wasn't like we could then say, we're not doing it because we think the EPA would be better off writing rules on something involving the environment. That's not a margin we could operate on that. But it's a good point. Yeah.
I would say if the question is to extend understanding of whether there are harms or unintended consequences kind of on both sides of that equation, so consumers and financial institutions, then this is an opportunity where measuring harm in a number of ways, hardship, the cost of foreclosure of a family moving, the mental health effects of that, the dislocation from schools and from communities, and the societal effects of families being uprooted from foreclosure, and then prevented access from entree again into credit markets. Seems to me in this question would also raise additional significant potential costs to borrowers who would have otherwise experienced foreclosure. On the face of it, this seems to me what I would have in mind in thinking about mitigating consumer harm, thinking of consumer as the borrower and the person in that interaction. And monetizing value is one way to compare whether that happened, but for borrowers, right, the monetary effects can be extensive if they're thinking of uprooting a household to adjust for that experience.
And there is research in your space that monetizes this to some extent?
No, I think that's my suggestion. Although I can't say that there's not research that would monetize that. But my suggestion is if it is being monetized, then for borrowers, what is the cost of being foreclosed upon, and needing to relocate, place kids in school? What effects does that have kind of long-term educationally, and then economic, then for economic mobility? I think there are a number of ways of extending how value is being monetized there.
So we did actually look at some of that literature when we were writing the thing about the impact analyses of the rule. We did find some counts and information about foreclosure and relocation, and there are even some data research on children's grades and performance, that kind of thing. But it is also the case that for many of those, foreclosure is a technical process. These folks were on track to have to move, maybe through a more voluntary, more timely, sell the house and then move to another location. So there was arguably a move in the offing there, no matter for most of these folks. Now, not for the ones who we mitigated, but for a lot of these folks. So but there can be an incremental harm when it's forced like that versus just a bit more planned. We were thinking along those lines as well. But yes, thank you. Someone else.
So, Paul, I thought you said at the very outset that you really didn't have a definition of harm, or the profession doesn't have a definition of harm, but then we're talking about, are these harms or not? It's like, I just don't know. I mean, if we don't have a definition for what a harm is, how can we talk about harm?
Well, we'll get to the question 3 in a moment, but
I promise I didn't look ahead.
But it's still open terrain, and so agree. We want to have as precise as we can, but it does seem to be difficult to come up with a good one-size-fits-all. That's why, in many practical matters, we deal with factors, just as we do for deception and unfairness, and factors you look at. And evaluating a merger, there'll be factors. So, yeah.
So I assume when you ask the question, you have your own answer already, and you're trying to see whether we say something. No, not at all. Okay. Then along the lines of what Mike was suggesting, I wonder if you just take a look at litigations that are like class action lawsuits, et cetera, and see what the experts offer on both sides, because you can imagine, a plaintiff offering some analysis that greatly inflates the nature of the harm, and then you look at what the defendants say on the opposite side, just look at how that works through. It's probably likely to at least point to some good factors to look at if you're trying to quantify the harms, because that's always a part of the damages part.
I mean, I think, so I guess I get that we're going to go to the really tough question next and then even later, but I guess as I think about this, just in the interest of full disclosure, I'm thinking about the utility or satisfaction of a consumer, right? If that goes up, consumers are better off. If that goes down, consumers are worse off. That's why I live in an ivory tower. Now, if you want me to make that utility depend upon the impact on household functionality and where your kids go to school, boy, I'm not smart enough to do that. That's why I live in an ivory tower. But in principle, one can structurally estimate a model, if you believe the model, and try to, you know as well as I do, Paul, you can do that kind of thing. But I guess as I'm looking at this question, and maybe I'm not looking at the question the same light everyone else is, but if the reason we have fewer delinquencies is because 5 million people that would have had homes prior to 2014 no longer have homes, okay? Because it's tougher to get a mortgage, because they've got to put more money in their escrow, or I don't know enough details here to talk intelligently about it, but I can imagine a way where you can reduce the number of delinquencies or foreclosures, right? In a way that, in my mind, you've got to ask the question, okay, well, how much utility would the household have received from having a house from 1999 to 2014, send the kids off to college, and now have their house foreclosed on? That's the but-for world without the policy. And it's a thorny, it's easy as an academic to frame the question you have to ask. It's darn tough to quantify that. And so it's not clear the way this is framed that, that you've reduced delinquencies by just flat telling 26,000 borrowers that you can't borrow money to buy a house. If I just pick those people out of a hat and say, you can't buy a house, and I pick 26,000 of them, I've satisfied exactly this criteria. And, have I made those people better off? Other things equal, I have. But other things isn't equal if by doing this I'm taking them out of a house. So, but that's why I live in an ivory tower. It's hard to do it's really hard to do what you're asking.
So the data shows that delinquency servicing, while always maybe before 2007 was maybe double the cost of non-delinquency servicing, delinquency servicing is not only more like 4 times the rate now of non-delinquency servicing, but has also grown by a huge factor. It's easily, I forget if it's $1,000 or $2,000 a loan, but it's very expensive. And that are the other kinds of effects that you're talking about. We don't attribute them to the rule because the timing doesn't quite line up in the reports. But there's no question that if you're going to go into the business of being a mortgage loan servicer, you are now looking at a much more expensive investment before, and the return you're going to need is very different. But the business has changed, and we may have changed it. It's a trade-off.
And that translates into higher rates for consumers that want to get loans, which by the law of demand reduces the number of consumers that are going to get mortgages that are serviced, right?
All right.
Do the data show that?
Do the data show what?
Do the rates change with the regulation? Because it should follow if Mike is correct.
I don't, well, you'd have to control for a lot because the economy was steadily improving and rates, interest rates have just secular down. So, frankly, I don't recall if one of the chapters we actually looked at that.
I think, Paul, in the ATR-QM report, and that rule took effect at the same time as the servicing report, we looked at mortgage interest rates there because we wanted to see whether there was any evidence that that rule had affected interest rates. And I think we couldn't find any. I mean, couldn't control for all factors you want to control for, but no evidence of an increase. But that doesn't say that it wouldn't have gone. It wouldn't have been better had there not been these rules. That was the thing we couldn't tease out, as I recall the ATRQM report.
Yes, thanks.
Those are exactly the right things for you guys to be looking at, and that's great that you're looking at them.
So here's an abstract one for you, Mike. In principle, it's possible to measure the amount of money a consumer is willing to pay to avoid a negative outcome or reduce the chance of a negative outcome. Measure of willingness to pay could perhaps be used to measure consumer harm. Obviously, I'm not writing down demand curves and indirect utility functions here, but Mike knows, everybody knows that. So there's a formal way to approach this. What do you consider to be the pros and cons of this approach? Do you consider such an approach practical, say, through laboratory experiments? Should the measure of consumer harm be the amount of money over and above the financial cost of the harm, since the financial cost is a transfer to other agents, or the total amount itself? And this gets to broader conversations about how we think about transfers from consumers to providers or even among consumers, but just focus on from consumers to the providers of good or service in this world.
Well, Paul, I'll say that the amount of money I'm willing to pay for car insurance is a lot more than I have to pay for car insurance. So I don't know how you can measure. I would think you'd want to measure what people actually pay versus what they're willing to pay. Is the idea of consumer surplus, but
But as you know, if you can estimate a demand curve, you can estimate consumer surplus.
right. Yeah. But my point is, why don't we estimate the actual price, not the consumer surplus?
I'll jump again because this is my world. So, in general, these kinds of measures are not very reliable. So if you ask people about their willingness to pay, it's not straight out. It's not very reliable. People use methods to try to make the elicitation more incentive compatible, but they don't really match the real market. In the world, I was mentioning class action lawsuits. Again, in the world of class action lawsuits, it's a super common methodology to use a technique called conjoint analysis. I don't know if you're familiar with that idea. Conjoint analysis, a little bit. Okay, so the idea is that people are making trade-offs in multi-attribute products, and they're able to estimate how someone would trade off a feature of a product, say something that's got the harmful aspect versus not, in a, say it's got 10 attributes and price is one of them, and you can back out from that analysis what the implied incremental price a given individual is willing to pay to get that, to move from one level of some feature, let's say the harmful level, to a different level of the feature. There's a really nice critique of that approach in Class Action written by a guy named Olivier Tubia in the business school at Columbia. Usually when they do that, it's often it's the case that it's a product that has like, let's say you're doing in a litigation about an automobile. It's got thousands of features, and they pick out 10 of them, and they do this exercise. That typically greatly inflates the estimate of what the economic value is of changing that one attribute that's supposedly the harmful attribute. And so like the main problem with these elicitation methods is that they, to the extent that the product is one with multiple features, you call attention to a subset of features and put therefore in the background the remaining features and greatly overestimate the real world sensitivity to the features in question.
When you say in the background, you mean in the person's mind?
Yes, exactly, because the methodology doesn't bring those other features as part of the method, and so even though in the real world they might affect the person's trade-offs, in that method that's often used in litigation, those things are suppressed.
Okay, but if it was that or nothing, I mean, just to press you a little. So, okay, we don't have perfect methodologies. What's your take on this in general? Promising, worth pursuing? Should we all be reading this paper? Should we, the related literature?
Yeah, you should. I mean, it sounds like you're only sounds like you nodded your head that you sort of were familiar with that methodology. It's a good methodology to study. Conjoint analysis. I can give you some references.
Yeah. Well, Mike Kane looks up.
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
Others? Anyone want to just take a bite at this more technical question? Of course, willingness to pay is the bread and butter of welfare economics. It's been that way for nearly a century. So, and it is the go-to concept for in thinking about wealth in all aspects of welfare economics. And one think that there would be a form of it relevant to these credit products, taking into account the scope of what they are, to know that you won't be, to know that you have error resolution rights. Is there willingness to pay for that, even if there's a higher mortgage rate? To know that the agents who will be collecting debt down the road are subject to certain restrictions that might also raise the costs up front. Is there a willingness to pay for that? I mean, this is kind of the thinking that needs to go on.
I think it's an important question. That's why it's not that I think I have an important answer, but I think it's an important question. I'd like you guys to participate here because I think, Dodd-Frank talks about risk to consumers. And, I cross the street here in Washington, D.C. and risk my life every time I do so, right? And you laugh at that, but I work at a university. And to walk from the parking garage to my office, you cross a street called Fee Lane. Openly walk there. Now you think about how you could reduce risks of traffic accidents in Washington, D.C. You could literally put up barriers that prevented anyone from crossing any street in Washington, D.C. at some cost, correct? We don't do that, correct? Well, at Indiana University, we had a student die, and guess what the university did? They erected barriers at that location to prevent that. And again, love my university and my employer, but I would argue that is just a reaction to an event that happened, right? Building a barrier in that one location, maybe it'll help, but I worry that those types of public funds that are dispersed are emotional expenditures rather than rational expenditures, and that's why I encourage you to think about the question. It's not that the university made a good or a bad decision, or that consumers aren't at risk if their loans are foreclosed on, but if we don't better understand what the real costs are and what the real benefits are of the solutions we propose, then we're not basing public policy on science. And, I'm a scientist. I like to think I am anyway. So.
Are any transportation engineers watching, or even from the Department of Transportation? I think they would say, Mike, we knew that. That's a tough call. They have to write regulations too for federal projects. Okay.
Paul,
So
can I jump in for 1 second? I just wanted to note how fun this is to turn the tables on a group of professors, put them on the spot. This is students' revenge for me. Thanks.
So I just wanted to add, my profession has a kind of a totally different kind of view on questions like this, where we have often used like restorative justice circles to determine what would be the response to a harm that was experienced that could be identified and resolved, which is completely different than, would frame the question completely differently and therefore require a different set of approaches to understanding potential solutions. That in thinking of Mike's example of the death and the sidewalk crossing and the erection of barriers, that has been for me in some of my work for juveniles that have been sentenced to state care for some sort of crime that was committed, engaging them in a process with the victims or the survivors of the crime to discuss what would be an appropriate for both parties to consider. What is the appropriate kind of restitution, and sometimes it is simply that conversation. So as observing conflict resolution mediations in Pittsburgh, and there was a group of young kids that were just they were playing, they were throwing rocks, not at people or buildings, but they were just kids and playing. And one broke through the window of a car. There was a baby in the car. The baby was fine, but the kids were taken in for questioning and were diverted through, kind of this conflict resolution mediation process. And the harm that they were seeking to mitigate was like the parents of the baby were very concerned, right, clearly that this had happened. But the process of that conversation was allowing the kids to realize what could have been the outcome of their actions, and that conversation was sufficient, as decided by all parties, that could, in that case, serve as a restitution or response to that experience. So I think, there are, clearly kind of the economic approaches, the foundation of economics, it sounds. This is the question is the foundation of economics. But I think there are other kind of disciplinary approaches to some of those questions.
So one quick response to that. At the height of the financial crisis, for those of us who were paying attention to servicing issues, there was a call at one point, by people who were dealing with their servicers and were saying, this person doesn't have an interest in working out with me. I want to talk to the creditor. I want to talk to the person who owns my loan, because I think that person I could work this out with. But I want to talk to that person. But there is, in our world, in the world of finance, there actually was no such person. It's in a securitized pool. There's a trustee for the pool. The trustee doesn't have that responsibility. There's really not another human being. But the homeowners were pushing, were asking for this, and there was a lot of people were perplexed and felt that there just wasn't a counterparty of the sort that you're just describing to talk to. And as markets work through these anonymous mechanisms, it's kind of how it is. But it also limits certain kinds of conversations that even in our world, people sometimes call for.
So Paul, let me add in that in the non-bank lending space, those people do exist. I mean, you can do workouts with various small dollar lending products. So those aren't sold. Those aren't securitized and sold. Just point of clarification.
We want to make sure we got to the very last question. In regard to enforcement cases and remedies, should the Bureau use standard economic approaches, such as before and after studies, randomized controlled treatment experiments, or difference in difference methodologies to evaluate, this is specifically about enforcement cases and remedies, or are other approaches at least as useful? So this one does drill down specifically to the enforcement context. We've got just a little time for it, but for those with experience in this, maybe you'd like to speak to this, Josh and Mike.
Sure. I mean, I'm happy to go first. I mean, with the first, yes, with respect to the first question. I mean, of course, there are other valuable approaches for understanding, whether this sort of goes back to the opening remark, whether we're sort of trying to identify materiality in some context or the presence of consumer injury. I don't know how you do that without having some sort of model constructed of the counterfactual world. And I think all of these tools, this is what you describe as the standard economic approaches, are, getting as close as we can in a context-specific setting to, a reasonable and reliable counterfactual. I mean, sometimes we can do it really well, and other times some of the questions require more imperfect counterfactuals, in which case we want to run all of the approaches and see if they're getting us robust answers or not. I've been in an agency and voted for cases. I understand sometimes we can't do all the approaches because we have to vote tomorrow, right? Or yesterday, as the case may be. But I think as a methodological commitment, whether it's enforcement cases, remedies, et cetera, I think the real strength, and of course there are drawbacks as well in terms of data requirements and all of that, but the real strength of the economic approach is the analysis is centered around the compared to what question. What would the impact be on the population that we're interested in protecting with and without the conduct? You know, economics has been, I mean, including with the consumer welfare question, I mean, economic methodology is sort of, it's built for that. I mean, that's sort of what all of these methods are attempting to do in different ways. So certainly not to the exclusion of other approaches, but I don't know how one can be confident that they were a good steward of the resources that they are sort of granted to go out and protect consumers if they don't also answer the question, what would happen if we didn't do this?
You invited me, so I mean, I'm an academic. I'm never going to turn down an invitation like this. Unless it's an invitation to collude, then I will not accept. No, I agree with what Josh said. I think you know, relevant but-for analysis is the appropriate way. If you guys don't do it as a bureau, I guarantee when you get to court, your adversaries are going to be using those techniques, and you want to make sure that you've stress test your analysis in that regard. The only other thing I will say is, you know, saying but-for analysis is easy, but I think there needs to be important dialogue between the economists and lawyers within the Bureau. Just to give you a simple example, you can think of, imagine you've got a deception case. And as a matter of economics, the relevant but-for question is, okay, how much would, you know, for a mortgage instrument, you deceive someone about how much you were going to pay or something like that. The relevant question is, okay, in the but-for world without deception, how would consumers have behaved? And that differential in their behavior and the amount of money that the lender obtained as a result of that deceptive activity is the harm, right? The ill-gotten gains, if you will. So that's the economic way of doing it. It might be that only 5% of borrowers changed their behavior, and as a result, the lender, you know, had $1 million more in loans than it would have otherwise had. You can calculate harm that way. But for analysis in the context of breach of contract, might say, well, how much would the party have collected had they not breached the contract? You said the mortgage was free, but now you're charging us 5% interest. That's a breach of contract. Well, there are two different, I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is there's two different ways to think about the benefit of the bargain in the case of a breach of contract versus the way I would contemplate harm in the context of deception. So if you come to me as an economist and say, gee, Mike, you know, we're thinking of a deception case, what's harm? I'll give you one answer. If you come to me and say, gee, Mike, this is a breach of contract case, how do you compute damages or harm? That's the benefit of the bargain. I may come up with a different answer using that. And that's why it's important, I think, for your legal teams and your economists to be on the same page so that the lawyers don't think they know what the appropriate measure of harm is in a matter that is claiming something other than that measure of harm.
Just to push a little on that, you know, the economists often, we want to work within our frame. We want to work within our framework as our discipline instructs, and then if it has to get cabined in for other reasons, that's fine. Nobody objects to that. But, you know, we might say, hey, here's a benefit or here's a harm. From, you know, an economic perspective, it may not be cognizable under whatever practice we have to fit it into, but we want to, don't you think there's value in making sure there's a good hearing on the comprehensive, on the economic concepts here, I know you can't bill for that. You could, but
absolutely, and I'd not disagree. Maybe I didn't make myself clear at the end of the day. That's not unusual, I will add. But what I'm suggesting is that there are oftentimes two different ways of legitimately measuring harm depending upon what the alleged harm is. If you allege one type of harm, I mean, the but-for analysis is but for the harm. And if you have two different legal theories of harm, that could, in principle, give rise to two different measures of harm. And so all I'm suggesting is that don't forget that you folks at the Bureau are on the same team. I know some of you are economists, some of you are other stripes of social scientists, most of you are lawyers, I'm going to speculate. But I think there's value in making sure that whatever, even if you agree on how you go about measuring harm, make sure that measure of harm is linked to the alleged acts in the complaint. And there'll be no discussion. Just joking. I've actually exceeded our time, and that's because I am a monopolist. I think John was worried about monopolies earlier, but we've concluded who the monopolist is, I think. So anyway, thanks so much for the Bureau, first of all, for allowing us to participate in these conversations. They've been absolutely enlightening to me, and hopefully they were of value to you as well. I'd like to thank Director Craniger, Deputy Director David Silberman. I'd like to thank Tom Paul, Christopher Mufarage, Matt Cameron, Jason Brown, and everyone else on the Bureau staff, especially all the Kims and Kimberlys that have helped us along the way. Hopefully these discussions are kind of a good preview for what ARC will be able to do over the course of the next year and maybe even the year following that. And we just thank you for that opportunity, and I've now formally adjourned the meeting.